The first thing my father said when he saw my photo on the front page of the Washington Post wasn't, "I'm proud of you." It wasn't congratulations. It wasn't even, "How have you been?" Number. He stared at the picture of me standing beside a 4-star Air Force general inside the Pentagon, lowered the newspaper slowly onto the kitchen table, and said to my mother in the kind of voice people use when they realize they may have made a very expensive mistake, "How much money do you think she makes?" My mother went pale. 3 hours later, my phone rang for the first time in 8 months. "Emily," my father said carefully, "we need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." I remember looking down at the screen in silence while rain slid against the windows of my apartment in Arlington. Outside, traffic crawled through the wet streets of Washington like veins pulsing beneath gray skin. Inside my apartment, everything was still except the ticking clock above the kitchen sink and the faint hum of my dryer running in the next room. Family meeting. The same family that once forgot my deployment date. The same family that laughed when I showed up to Thanksgiving in uniform because I had come straight from base. The same family that called me the government daughter like it was some kind of punchline. And suddenly, they wanted a meeting. I almost laughed. Instead, I told him I'll think about it. Then I hung up. But that wasn't where the story started. It started the week before when my mother looked me dead in the eyes and told me not to waste their time with my little soldier ceremony. And somehow, that hurt more than all the years before it. I'm Colonel Emily Carter, 34 years old, United States Air Force. Most people who meet me now assume I was born confident, disciplined, untouchable. That's the funny thing about uniforms. They make people think strength comes naturally. It doesn't. Sometimes strength is just humiliation that survived long enough to harden into silence. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, in a family that worshipped appearances. My father, Richard Carter, sold commercial insurance for 30 years and believed success should always be visible. Big house, loud opinions, expensive watch, country club membership. If people couldn't see your importance immediately, he assumed you didn't have any. My older brother Daniel inherited that trait like it was family jewelry. Daniel drove luxury cars he couldn't afford and talked about networking like he was running Wall Street instead of flipping half-empty condo units with borrowed money. My mother adored him. Even when he failed, she described it like temporary genius. "He's ambitious," she'd say proudly. Meanwhile, I joined the military at 19 because college wasn't financially realistic, and because secretly I wanted to leave home before I forgot who I was. My father never forgave me for it. "You're too smart for the military," he told me the day I enlisted. "That's where people go when they run out of options." I still remember standing in our driveway with my duffel bag while summer heat rose off the pavement in waves. I wanted him to hug me goodbye. Instead, he checked his watch. That became the pattern of our relationship. Every promotion I earned somehow became smaller when it entered their house. "Captain, that sounds administrative." "Major, so still not a real commander?" "Lieutenant Colonel, I can never keep track of those ranks." And whenever relatives asked what I did, my mother would wave her hand vaguely and say, "Emily works somewhere in military logistics." Somewhere, as if I stocked shelves in a warehouse. What none of them understood was that logistics in the military meant responsibility, pressure, lives. It meant 14-hour days coordinating emergency transport during hurricanes. It meant memorizing supply chains across continents. It meant making decisions while exhausted because people you would never meet depended on you getting things right. But families like mine don't respect invisible labor. They respect status they can brag about at dinner parties. The call about the Pentagon ceremony came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing transportation readiness reports at Andrews Air Force Base. I answered expecting another scheduling update. Instead, a senior general's office informed me I'd been selected for a distinguished service recognition tied to Operation Iron Harbor, a multinational emergency deployment mission we'd coordinated the previous year after catastrophic flooding overseas. The operation had nearly collapsed 3 times. For 11 days, I slept less than 20 hours total while managing cargo reroutes, medical airlift coordination, and equipment transfers through 6 different countries. When it was over, nobody outside the military knew my name. That was normal. But now apparently someone high above me had noticed. The ceremony would take place at the Pentagon the following Friday. For almost an hour after the call, I debated whether to invite my parents. I should have known better. Still, some stupid little part of me, the 19-year-old girl standing in that driveway with a duffel bag, wanted them there. Wanted them to finally see me. So that evening I called. My mother answered on the 3rd ring while some television show played loudly in the background. "Emily, everything okay?" I got invited to a recognition ceremony at the Pentagon next Friday, I said carefully. I thought maybe you and Dad would want to come. Silence. Then a small laugh. Not cruel at first. Just dismissive. A ceremony for what? It's for Operation Iron Harbor. Oh. Another pause. Honey, aren't those military events kind of boring? I felt my grip tighten on the phone. It's important to me. Before she could answer, my father's voice echoed faintly in the background. Who is it? Emily. What does she want? She invited us to some military thing. I heard him scoff. Then my mother came back on the line, her tone changing into that familiar sweetness people use when they think they're being reasonable. Emily, sweetheart, you're just a low-ranking soldier. Don't make us waste time driving all the way to D.C. for some meaningless ceremony. Low-ranking soldier. At 34 years old? After 15 years of service? For a second I couldn't speak. Then my father shouted loudly enough for me to hear without speakerphone. Tell her to call us when she becomes a general. My chest tightened so suddenly it almost felt physical. Not anger. Not yet. Something older than anger. Something heavier. I looked around my apartment after the call ended. The framed commendations on the wall, the deployment coins on my bookshelf, the folded flag inside the glass case near my desk. An entire life. And somehow to them I was still a disappointment wearing camouflage. That night I barely slept. By morning something inside me had gone quiet. Not broken. Just finished. Finished trying to earn affection from people who treated love like a performance review. Friday arrived cold and bright. Washington carried that sharp winter air that makes every breath feel cleaner than it really is. Black SUVs lined the Pentagon entrance while officers in dress uniforms crossed the courtyard with measured precision. I stood alone near the security checkpoint adjusting my service jacket while sunlight flashed across the silver eagle on my shoulder. No family. No congratulations. Just me. Oddly enough, that made breathing easier. As I walked toward the entrance, I caught my reflection briefly in the dark glass doors. For the first time in years, I stopped wishing my parents could see what I saw. A woman who had built herself from nothing they ever gave her. And as the Pentagon rose around me like a fortress of steel and history, I quietly told myself something I should have admitted long ago. For once, I was done begging to be seen. The Pentagon has a certain sound when you walk through it in dress uniform. Leather soles against polished floors. Quiet conversations cut short when senior officers pass. The distant hum of security doors opening and closing. Everything controlled. Everything measured. I had spent years inside military facilities, but that morning felt different. Not because I was nervous. Because for the first time in my career, people kept stopping me to say thank you. A colonel from Transportation Command shook my hand outside the corridor leading to the ceremony hall. Heard what you did during Iron Harbor, he said. A lot of people made it home because you kept that operation alive. I nodded politely, but his words stayed with me. A lot of people made it home. That was the thing civilians rarely understood about military logistics. Nobody noticed us when we succeeded. But if we failed, people died quietly and far away from cameras. The ceremony room itself wasn't enormous. No dramatic movie-style ballroom. Just a formal Pentagon conference hall with rows of seats, American flags positioned with mathematical precision, and senior officers moving through the crowd with restrained authority. I found my assigned seat near the front. Colonel Carter. I turned and saw Brigadier General Howard Reeves approaching me with an easy smile. I recognized him immediately. He'd overseen part of the European coordination during Iron Harbor. Sir. At ease, he said softly. You look surprised to be here. A little, sir? He laughed quietly. That means you're probably the right person for the award. Then his expression shifted. Most people in this building know Iron Harbor almost collapsed halfway through. I remembered that night instantly. 3 countries refusing clearance approval. Weather shutting down routes. Medical shipments stranded overseas. 47 minutes from complete operational failure. I had stood in a temporary command room at Ramstein Air Base with bloodshot eyes and coffee-stained paperwork, while half the senior staff argued over protocol. And eventually I'd ignored protocol. I rerouted aircraft without waiting for full authorization. Risked my career. Saved the mission. General Reeves lowered his voice slightly. You made decisions most officers would have been too afraid to make. Sir, I just did my job. No, he said firmly, you did more than that. Before I could respond, another officer approached him and he gave me one final nod before walking away. I sat there afterward staring at the folded program in my lap. For years, my family had reduced my career to jokes about paperwork and uniforms. Meanwhile, strangers inside the Pentagon understood exactly what I had carried. The ceremony began promptly at 10. Medals, citations, formal introductions. Then my name was called. Colonel Emily Carter. I stood, smoothed my jacket instinctively, and walked toward the stage beneath the bright overhead lights. The room blurred slightly around the edges the way it always did during emotionally significant moments. Not panic, just adrenaline narrowing the world. I remember hearing fragments as the citation was read aloud. Exceptional leadership. Critical international coordination. Directly responsible for successful medical evacuation operations. Saved countless civilian and military lives. Then came the handshake. General Thomas Whitaker, 4-Star Air Force Command. A man whose face appeared regularly on national news. He held my hand firmly and looked directly at me before leaning closer. The military needs more officers like you, Colonel. Simple sentence. But after a lifetime of being treated invisible by my own family, those words landed somewhere deep. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room. And for the first time since I joined the Air Force, I allowed myself one dangerous thought. Maybe I had finally become someone impossible to dismiss. After the ceremony ended, several journalists from military publications gathered near the reception area. Normally, I avoided media attention whenever possible, but protocol required brief interviews. One reporter asked, "What motivated you during Iron Harbor?" I answered honestly. People were depending on us. Once you understand that clearly enough ego disappears, you just focus on bringing everyone home. Another asked whether leadership came naturally to me. I almost laughed. No, I said. Leadership usually comes from surviving difficult people. The reporter smiled politely, assuming I meant military pressure. I let him believe that. By late afternoon, I returned to my apartment exhausted but strangely calm. The city outside glowed gold beneath the setting sun while traffic rolled slowly past the Potomac. I changed out of my uniform, carefully hanging the jacket with practiced precision before loosening my collar and sitting on the couch in silence. No celebration dinner, no family waiting, just quiet. Honestly, I preferred it that way. Around 7 that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an old family friend named Carol Simmons. "Saw your photo online. Your parents must be so proud." I stared at the message for several seconds before setting the phone face down on the table. That word again. Proud. People assumed parents naturally became proud once success became visible enough. They didn't understand that some families resent your success more than your failure, especially when your success exposes how badly they underestimated you. The next morning, everything exploded. I woke to 17 missed calls, 3 voicemails, 9 text messages. My first thought was that something terrible had happened. Then I opened one of the messages from my cousin Natalie. "Emily, are you at the Pentagon right now?" Underneath it was a photograph. The Washington Post. Front section. And there I was, standing beside General Whitaker in full dress uniform, while both of us faced the cameras beneath the Pentagon seal. The headline read, "Colonel Emily Carter honored for strategic leadership during international crisis response." Colonel, not low-ranking soldier. Not Emily who works somewhere in logistics. Colonel Emily Carter. I sat very still at the edge of my bed while sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. Then my phone rang again. Dad. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded different immediately. Careful, measured. The way people speak when they suddenly realize they may not fully understand the person on the other end. Emily. Dad. Long pause. We saw the article. I figured. Another pause. Your parents spend your entire childhood teaching you to recognize emotional shifts in their voices. Even after years apart, I could hear everything underneath his silence. Confusion. Embarrassment. Calculation. You never told us, he began slowly. Told you what? That you were, he hesitated, important. I nearly smiled at that word. Important. As if value only became real after newspapers printed it. I tried inviting you to the ceremony. That's not what I mean. Of course it wasn't. Because what bothered him wasn't missing the event. It was discovering other people respected me more than he did. Behind him, I could hear my mother speaking rapidly in the background. Ask her if that general knows senators. Richard, ask her if she's on television again tonight. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. Not love. Opportunity. My father cleared his throat. Your mother and I think maybe we should all sit down together. Why? We're family. Funny how that word only appeared when my status became useful. I walked toward the kitchen window while holding the phone. Outside, Arlington moved normally beneath gray skies. Joggers passed on sidewalks. Cars stopped at intersections. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed faintly. Ordinary life continuing while my family suddenly rewrote who they thought I was. "We need to talk," my father said again. "Family meeting tomorrow." I leaned one shoulder against the window frame. 8 months earlier, I'd called home during Christmas leave. Nobody answered because Daniel had apparently rented a lake house for the family and forgotten to mention the trip to me. Now they wanted a meeting, because a newspaper told them I mattered. When I asked quietly, relief flooded his voice immediately. "Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. I'll see if I can make it. Emily," his tone softened carefully, "we're proud of you." The words should have meant something. Instead, they felt late. Very late. After we hung up, I stood motionless in my kitchen for a long time. Then I walked into my spare room and unlocked a small black fireproof box inside the closet. Folders. Financial documents, wire transfer records, medical payment receipts, 12 years of secrets. I carried one black folder back to the kitchen table and opened it slowly. Every hidden thing I'd done for them sat inside those pages. Things they never noticed, never questioned, never thanked me for. And as rain began tapping softly against the windows again, I realized something with absolute clarity. Tomorrow wasn't going to be a reunion. It was going to be an awakening. My parents' house looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. The white colonial home in Richmond had once felt enormous when I was a child. A place where every room carried rules, expectations, tensions you learned to navigate quietly if you wanted peace. But when I pulled into the driveway the next afternoon, the house suddenly looked like what it really was. A carefully maintained shell full of people terrified of appearances cracking. My father's BMW sat in the driveway beside Daniel's black Range Rover, the one he absolutely could not afford. Fresh mulch had been spread around the flower beds recently. My mother always panic cleaned when she wanted to impress people. Apparently now I qualified as people. I stayed in the car for almost a minute after turning off the engine. Rain clouds hung low over Richmond, heavy and gray, making the neighborhood feel muted. I could see movement through the front curtains. They were watching for me. That alone almost made me laugh. When I was younger, they never watched for me. Not after deployments. Not after training exercises. Not even after my first overseas assignment. But today they were waiting at the window. I stepped out wearing civilian clothes instead of my uniform dark jeans, black coat hair tied neatly back. I'd considered arriving in dress blues, then decided against it. I didn't need the uniform anymore. The newspaper had already done the talking for me. Before I even reached the porch, the front door swung open. "Emily," my mother said brightly. Too brightly. She moved toward me quickly, arms half open, as if we were the kind of family that hugged naturally. I noticed the slight hesitation when I didn't immediately move closer, so she awkwardly touched my arm instead. "You made it." "Looks that way." Behind her, my father appeared in the hallway wearing one of his expensive golf sweaters. Daniel stood farther back near the dining room entrance, holding a coffee mug. All three of them looked at me differently now. Not warmer, just more careful. Like investors studying a stock they may have underestimated. Dad stepped forward first. "You look good." "I'm alive, that usually helps." He forced a chuckle. No one else laughed. The smell inside the house hit me immediately, coffee lemon furniture polish and the faint scent of my mother's vanilla candles. The exact same smell from 20 years ago. Funny how memory works. Sometimes scent travels deeper than emotion. "Come sit," Mom said quickly. I made lunch. Of course she had. Because now there was something to gain from hospitality. We moved into the dining room where the table had been fully set like it was Thanksgiving instead of a tense family meeting nobody wanted to define honestly. Daniel leaned back in his chair with an uncomfortable smile. "So, Colonel Carter." There was teasing in his tone, but weaker than before. I sat across from him calmly. "Still sounds strange when you say it." His jaw tightened slightly. "Good." For years, Daniel had treated me like background noise at family gatherings. He interrupted me, constantly mocked military life, once asked whether I was basically a glorified airport manager. Now suddenly he couldn't maintain eye contact. Dad cleared his throat. "Well, first things first." He folded his hands together. "Your mother and I want to say we're proud of you." There it was again. That word. Proud. I looked at him carefully. When did that start? Silence settled heavily across the table. My mother jumped in too quickly. "Oh, Emily, don't do that." "Do what?" "Be difficult." I almost smiled. Interesting. They had ignored me for years, but the moment I stopped pretending not to notice, I became difficult. Dad exhaled slowly. We didn't realize how significant your role was. You didn't ask. That's not fair. No, I leaned back slightly. You called my Pentagon ceremony meaningless. Mom looked embarrassed for exactly 2 seconds before defensiveness returned. Well, we thought you were exaggerating. That sentence landed harder than she intended. Because she truly meant it. My own family genuinely believed I wasn't capable of becoming important. Daniel rubbed his neck awkwardly. To be fair, Em, you never talked much about your career. I looked directly at him. Every time I tried, you changed the subject back to yourself. His face reddened immediately. Dad cut in before Daniel could answer. The point is, things are different now. And there it was. The real conversation finally entering the room. Different now. Not because they suddenly loved me more. Because my value had changed. I stayed quiet and let him continue. He glanced briefly toward my mother before speaking carefully. Your article opened some doors. What kind of doors? Well, he shifted in his chair. People pay attention to military leadership, government connections, influence. I could almost hear the script forming in his head. Mom reached for her coffee cup. Your cousin Natalie said you probably know senators now. Of course she did. I stared at them for several seconds. Then I asked quietly, why am I really here? Nobody answered immediately. Daniel looked down at the table. That told me everything. Finally, Dad sighed heavily. Daniel's company has been struggling. There it was. The truth. Daniel sat up defensively. The market shifted. No, I said calmly. You over-leveraged bad properties during inflated pricing. His eyes snapped toward me. You don't know anything about real estate. No, but I know how numbers work. Dad raised a hand quickly. Emily, we're just asking for guidance. What kind of guidance? Another pause. Then my father said the sentence I had expected from the moment the phone rang yesterday morning. We were hoping maybe you could help. Not emotionally, financially, socially, strategically. Whatever benefited them most. Mom leaned forward with sudden enthusiasm. You probably know people in Washington, important people. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. That seemed to offend her. What's funny? You still don't care what I actually do. Dad frowned. That's not true. Really, I opened my bag slowly and removed the black folder. Then let's test that. The room changed immediately. My father stared at the folder. What's that? I placed it carefully on the table between us. 12 years. Daniel frowned. What? 12 years of things none of you noticed. I opened the folder. The first paper was a bank statement. My mother looked confused until I slid it toward her. Then her face drained of color. That's... Her voice faltered. Our mortgage account. Yes. Dad grabbed the paper. I watched realization begin creeping slowly across his face. Monthly payments. Anonymous transfers. Dates stretching back years. His eyes widened. What is this? The house almost went into foreclosure in 2015, I said quietly. You remember that? Nobody spoke. Of course they remembered. Dad had blamed the economy for months afterward. What you didn't know, I continued, was that the bank received enough money to stop the process 2 days before legal seizure. Mom stared at me. I nodded once. Daniel shook his head slowly. That's impossible. No, what's impossible is believing nobody in this family ever wondered how things magically worked out. I pulled out another document. Hospital payment records. My mother's surgery from 3 years earlier. The insurance gap they thought had mysteriously disappeared. Dad's hands actually trembled now. You paid for this. For all of it. Silence. Heavy. Humiliating silence. I looked at each of them carefully before speaking again. For 12 years, the low-ranking soldier you were embarrassed by quietly kept this family financially alive. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. My father looked older suddenly. Smaller. We didn't know. The words came out cracked and weak. And for the first time in my life, I finally said the thing sitting inside me for years. You never cared enough to know. Mom's eyes filled instantly. Daniel looked physically sick. But I wasn't angry anymore. That was the strange part. Anger requires hope. And somewhere over the years, hope had simply worn out. Dad swallowed hard. Emily, we're family. I closed the folder slowly. No, I said softly. Family doesn't wait for newspapers to tell them someone matters. Then I stood. Nobody tried to stop me immediately. I think they were too stunned. At the front door, I finally heard my father's voice behind me. Small. Fragile. Emily. I turned slightly. For a moment he looked less like the intimidating man from my childhood, and more like an aging father realizing too late that he had spent years looking past his own daughter. I really didn't know he whispered. I held his gaze. I know. Then I walked out into the cold Virginia rain and closed the door behind me. For 3 days after I left my parents' house, nobody called. Not my mother. Not Daniel. Not my father. That silence should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. It followed me around my apartment like a second shadow. I would be making coffee before sunrise and suddenly I'd hear my father's voice in my head. I really didn't know. I believed him. That was the worst part. He really hadn't known. Not because the truth had been hidden too well, but because I had been hidden in plain sight. At work, I buried myself in routine. Reports, briefings, budget reviews, meetings where people used words like readiness posture and deployment windows with the seriousness of surgeons discussing vital organs. Military life had a mercy to it when the mission started. Your feelings had to stand quietly in the hallway and wait. But they never left. On the 4th day, my phone began vibrating while I was leaving base. Daniel. I watched his name flash across the screen until the call disappeared. Then it came again. And again. By the time I reached my car, he had left a voicemail. I played it only after sitting behind the wheel with the door shut. Look, I don't know what Dad told you, but things are bad. Really bad. I've got people breathing down my neck, and if this company collapses, Mom and Dad are going to get dragged into it too. I know we've had our issues, but you have connections now. You can make one call. One call, Emily. He paused, breathing hard. Then his voice sharpened. Don't punish everyone just because you're mad. I deleted the message. Not because it didn't hurt. Because it sounded exactly like him. Daniel never asked forgiveness before asking for help. He simply placed his emergency in your lap and acted offended if you refused to carry it. That evening my mother texted, "Honey, your brother is under terrible stress. Please don't turn your back on family now." I stared at the word family until the letters stopped looking real. Family? The same word they used to excuse neglect. The same word they used to demand sacrifice. The same word they never seemed to apply when I was the one standing alone. I didn't answer. A week later, Richard Carter came to Arlington. No warning. No appointment. Just a quiet knock at my apartment door at 7:16 on a Thursday evening. When I opened it, my father stood in the hallway wearing a wool coat and holding his hat in both hands. He looked tired. Not dramatic, not broken in some theatrical way. Just tired like a man who had driven 90 miles with too many thoughts and no good ones. "Emily," he said. I didn't invite him in immediately. He noticed. His eyes lowered for a second. "I know I should have called. Yes, I wanted to see you. I almost said why now, but I already knew why. So I stepped aside." He entered slowly as if crossing into unfamiliar territory. In a way he was. My father had never visited my apartment before. He had never asked what it looked like, never wondered where I spent my evenings, never seen the life I built after leaving his house. His eyes moved across the room. The framed commendation near the bookshelf. The photograph of my unit in Germany. The folded flag in the glass case that belonged to Master Sergeant Elaine Brooks, my first mentor who died of cancer 5 years after retirement and had no children of her own. She'd left it to me because, in her words, I was stubborn enough to understand what it meant. Dad stopped in front of that case. Whose flag? Someone who treated me like family. The sentence landed quietly, but I saw it hit him. He looked away. For a while, neither of us spoke. I made coffee because silence needed something ordinary inside it. My father sat at my small kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug, though he didn't drink. "This is a nice place," he said finally. "It's mine." He nodded. I knew he heard the second meaning. Mine, not yours, not Daniel's, not something I built to impress you. "I drove past the Pentagon on the way here," he said. I'd never been that close. I leaned against the counter. "It's just a building." "No," he said quietly, "it isn't." That surprised me. He stared into his coffee like the answer might be floating there. I spent my life thinking success had a certain look. A firm handshake, a nice car, people laughing at your jokes because they needed something from you. A faint, bitter smile crossed his face. "I thought Daniel had it. I thought you were hiding from the real world." I said nothing. He looked up at me then, and for the first time I could remember, my father didn't seem to be performing authority. He just looked old. I was wrong. Those 3 words should have felt satisfying. They didn't. They felt late, like flowers sent to a house after everyone had moved away. "Daniel wants me to help," I said. "I know." So do you? His face tightened. A part of me did. At least it was honest. And now, he looked toward the flag case again. Now I think saving him one more time might be the cruelest thing anyone could do. That was the first decent thing he'd said in years. I folded my arms not defensively but to keep myself steady. I'm cutting off everything. The transfers, the medical gaps, the emergency payments, all of it. He closed his eyes briefly. My voice stayed calm. I won't use my name, my rank, or my reputation to rescue Daniel's business. I won't call senators, I won't pressure anyone. And I won't be the family bank anymore. When he opened his eyes, they were wet, not enough to spill over, but enough. I understand. No, I said, you accept it. Understanding may take longer. He flinched slightly but nodded. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue. The old Richard Carter would have. He would have called me cold, ungrateful, dramatic. He would have reminded me who paid for my braces, who kept a roof over my head, who taught me to ride a bike on a cracked suburban sidewalk. But this man stayed quiet. Maybe that was his first attempt at respect. When he finally stood to leave, it had started raining outside. The same soft Virginia rain that seemed to appear every time my life changed shape. At the door, he turned back. I thought success looked different, he said. I held the door open. That's because you only respected what people could brag about at dinner. His jaw worked once like he'd swallowed something sharp. Then he nodded. Outside, he stepped into the hallway, paused, and looked at me one last time. Not at my apartment. Not at the awards. At me. I'm sorry, Emily. I wanted that to fix something. I really did. But some apologies arrive carrying no tools. They can stand beside the damage, but they can't rebuild the house. I know, I said. He walked away slowly, and as I closed the door, I realized my revenge had never been about destroying them. It was this: letting them live without the daughter they only valued after losing access to her. A year later, my name appeared in the news again. Not the front page this time. Just a small military publication article most people would never read unless they already cared about that world. There was a photograph of me standing at a podium during a leadership symposium at Joint Base Andrews, speaking to a room full of young officers. The headline read, Colonel Emily Carter launches mentorship initiative for first-generation military leaders. I didn't send the article to my family. I didn't need to. By then, silence had become easier. Not painless. Just easier. Daniel's company collapsed in early spring. I heard about it from my cousin Natalie, who sent one careful text that began with, I don't want to get involved, but I thought you should know. That was how family gossip always arrived. Wrapped in fake concern delivered with perfect aim. Daniel lost the Range Rover first. Then the office downtown. Then the house he had insisted was an investment property with lifestyle flexibility, which was just his way of saying he couldn't afford it. My mother called twice after that. I didn't answer. She left one voicemail that lasted nearly 4 minutes. I listened to half of it while sitting in my car outside base. Her voice trembled, but not in the way I used to imagine when I was younger. Back then, I thought if my mother ever cried over me, it would feel like proof that I mattered. Instead, it sounded complicated. Emily, I know things haven't been easy between us, she said. But Daniel is still your brother. Your father barely sleeps. This whole situation has been very hard on everyone. Everyone. That was the part that made me press stop. Because even after everything, she still could not say what had been hard on me. That night, I deleted the voicemail and slept 6 straight hours for the first time in weeks. Healing didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like no longer explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. My father was different. He didn't call often, maybe once every 2 months, sometimes less. The calls were short, quiet, almost formal. How are you, he would ask. Busy, I'd say. Are you eating? Yes. Good. At first, I assumed he was building toward another request. He wasn't. That made the calls stranger. Then one afternoon in October, a letter arrived at my apartment. Real paper, cream envelope, my name written in my father's careful handwriting. I stood near the mailboxes for several seconds before opening it. Inside was one folded sheet. No long speech. No demand. No guilt. Just a few lines. Emily, I spent your whole life waiting for you to become someone important. I never realized you already were. I am sorry I made you prove what I should have known. Dad. I read it twice. Then a third time. The hallway around me blurred slightly, but I didn't cry. Not the way people expect in stories. There was no dramatic breakdown, no collapse against the wall. I simply folded the letter carefully and carried it upstairs. For 3 days it sat on my kitchen table beside my keys. I would glance at it in the morning while drinking coffee, see it again at night when I came home exhausted. Each time I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the first honest shape of grief. Because that was what people rarely told you. Sometimes when your family finally admits the truth, it doesn't erase the pain. It confirms it. It tells the younger version of you, the one who waited in driveways and airport terminals and quiet holiday corners, that she wasn't imagining it. She really had been overlooked. She really had been wounded. And she really had survived. The following month, I attended a military memorial service at Arlington National Cemetery. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. Rows of white headstones stretched across the hills like silent witnesses. A bugle played in the distance, its notes thin and aching under the pale winter sky. After the service, a young lieutenant approached me near the path. She couldn't have been more than 24. Dark hair pulled into a strict bun, dress uniform immaculate, eyes trying very hard not to look lost. "Colonel Carter." "Yes," she swallowed. "I heard you speak at Andrews, about leading when your family doesn't understand your service." I waited. Her hands tightened around her gloves. "My father thinks I'm wasting my life." There it was, the same old wound wearing a younger face. I looked at her, and for a moment I saw myself at 19 standing in my parents' driveway, with a duffel bag waiting for a hug that never came. So I said the thing no one had said to me then. Your life does not become smaller because someone else refuses to recognize its size. Her eyes filled, but she nodded quickly, trying to stay composed. I smiled gently. You don't have to convince everyone you matter. Just make sure you never forget it yourself. She thanked me and walked away toward the parking area, shoulders just a little straighter. That was when I understood what the real ending was. It wasn't my father's apology. It wasn't Daniel losing everything. It wasn't my mother finally realizing the daughter she dismissed had been holding the family together all along. The real ending was this. I had become the person I needed when I was younger. And maybe that was better than revenge. Months later, my father asked if he could attend one of my public ceremonies. I thought about saying no. The old part of me wanted to. But another part, older and calmer now, understood that boundaries didn't always require locked doors. Sometimes they required open doors with clear lines painted on the floor. So I said, you can come, but you come as a guest, not as someone owed a place. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I understand. This time I believed he was beginning to. At the ceremony, he sat in the second row, alone. No mother, no Daniel, no performance. When my name was called, I walked across the stage beneath the bright lights, accepted the citation, shook hands with another general, and turned toward the audience. My father was standing, not clapping wildly, not trying to draw attention, just standing straight, one hand pressed over his heart. For once he saw me, just not soon enough to be the reason I became strong, and maybe that was okay. Because I had stopped needing my family to prove my worth. I had already lived it. If this story touched something in you, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to become strong without the support you deserved. There are more stories like this waiting for you every day, so subscribe and stay with us for the next one. Sometimes the people who were overlooked the longest are the ones with the most powerful stories to tell. The pounding on the front door sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. Police opened the door. My father froze in the middle of lifting his coffee mug. My brother Jason looked up from the couch so fast he nearly dropped his phone. The television was still running some sports commentary in the background, loud enough to make the silence afterward feel sharp. Then came another bang. Mr. Frank Carter, open the door now. I stood near the kitchen doorway in my gray army sweatshirt, saying nothing. The smell of stale beer still lingered from the night before. My father slowly turned his head toward me, and for the first time in years, I watched uncertainty crawl across his face. What did you do? He whispered. I didn't answer, because 24 hours earlier he had stood in this same kitchen smiling, while he told me he had sold the military medal my grandfather gave me before he died. A medal that carried 30 years of sacrifice. A medal soaked in history. A medal that never belonged to him. He had laughed when I stared at the empty wooden box in my hands. Family sacrifices for each other, he'd said. Then he took another sip of whiskey, like what he'd done was normal. Like betrayal was some kind of parenting style. Another violent knock shook the door. Jason stood up now, panic already rising in his voice. Dad, why are cops here? But my father kept staring at me, and slowly the smile disappeared from his face. Because after 34 years of being the quiet daughter, the dependable one, the one who cleaned up everybody else's disasters. I had finally stopped sacrificing myself for this family, and my father had no idea what that was going to cost him. When I first came home from Kuwait, people kept telling me how lucky I was. You finally get to rest. Bet it feels good being home. Your father must be proud. That last one always sat strangely in my chest, because pride was never something my father gave freely, especially not to me. My brother Jason got pride. Jason got excuses. Jason got second chances, third chances, fourth chances. Jason got celebrated for surviving disasters he created himself. I got expectations. I pulled my truck into my father's driveway 3 weeks before everything exploded. The old house looked smaller than I remembered. The white paint was peeling around the porch rails, and one of the shutters hung crooked beside the upstairs window. My mother used to keep flower pots lined across the front steps every spring. After she died, the porch looked empty all year long. Dad opened the door before I even reached it. "Well," he said, looking me up and down, "Army finally let you go." I smiled faintly. Temporary leave. He stepped aside to let me in. No hug, no warmth, just the smell of black coffee, old leather furniture, and the television already too loud. Jason was asleep on the couch at 2 in the afternoon. Beer cans sat on the coffee table beside bedding slips and crumpled fast food wrappers. His boots were still on. One arm hung over his eyes dramatically, like he'd survived combat instead of another gambling binge. Dad lowered his voice. "Rough week for him." I stared at my brother for a second. "Looks exhausting." Dad ignored the tone. That was how things worked in our family. Jason made messes. Everyone else adjusted around them. Growing up, I used to think maybe if I worked harder, Dad would finally look at me the way he looked at Jason. Maybe if I got better grades. Maybe if I stayed out of trouble. Maybe if I joined the army. But people like my father didn't admire discipline. They admired need. Jason always needed something, and my father built his entire identity around rescuing him. The only person who ever really saw me was my grandfather, General Robert Carter. Even now, years after his death, people in town still talked about him like a legend. Decorated war hero, brilliant commander, a man with impossible standards and terrifying presence. But with me, he was patient, calm, kind. When I was 12, he taught me how to shine shoes properly because he said discipline begins with details nobody notices. When I enlisted, he was the only person in the family who looked genuinely proud. The last real conversation we had happened 6 months before he died. I was already overseas by then. We sat together on the back porch while cicadas screamed through the Georgia heat. His breathing had grown weaker, but his eyes were still sharp. He handed me a small wooden box. Inside was his bronze star medal. I immediately shook my head. "Grandpa, I can't take this." "Yes, you can. It belongs in the family." He looked directly at me then. "It belongs to the only person in this family who understands what sacrifice actually means." I still remember how heavy the medal felt in my hand. Not because of the medal, because of what it meant to him. Then he said something I didn't fully understand until years later. "Emily, don't ever let people use the word family to steal your self-respect." Back then I thought he was talking about the military, or leadership, or loyalty. I didn't realize he was warning me about my own father. The first week home was manageable. Jason avoided me most of the time unless he needed money for gas or cigarettes. Dad pretended everything was normal. I helped around the house, fixed the porch railing, replaced a leaking pipe under the sink. It almost felt peaceful sometimes. Then the phone calls started. At first, Dad would step outside to answer them. Then he started yelling. One night I heard him slam the kitchen counter hard enough to rattle dishes. "You'll get your damn money." When he turned around and saw me standing there, his entire face tightened. "What?" I folded my arms. "Who keeps calling? Nobody you need to worry about." But I already knew. Jason came stumbling into the kitchen an hour later, smelling like whiskey and sweat. He grabbed orange juice straight from the carton and avoided eye contact. "How much?" I asked quietly. He stopped drinking. Dad immediately snapped Emily. But I kept staring at Jason. "How much do you owe?" Jason laughed nervously. "It's complicated." "That means a lot." Silence. Then Dad exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. 70,000. The number hit the room like shattered glass. I stared at him. "You're kidding." "It got out of hand," Jason muttered. "You think." Dad stepped closer to me now, already preparing the speech I'd heard my entire life. "Your brother made mistakes, but family helps each other." There it was. The Carter family religion. Not accountability. Not responsibility. Sacrifice. Usually mine. Dad sat down slowly across from me. You've got savings, military benefits, steady income. I almost laughed. You want me to pay $70,000? It's not forever, he said quickly, just until Jason gets back on his feet. Jason nodded eagerly like this was completely reasonable. And something inside me finally cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly enough that I knew nothing would ever be the same after this moment. I looked at my father for a long time before speaking. Number? Dad blinked. Jason frowned. What do you mean no? I mean I'm not paying your debt. The room turned still. Dad's voice hardened immediately. After everything this family's done for you. I almost asked him what exactly that was. The silence stretched between us like a wire ready to snap. Then my father stood up slowly. Family sacrifices for each other, Emily. I met his eyes calmly. No, I said softly. Family isn't supposed to destroy one person to save another. The next morning I woke before sunrise the way I always did. Military habits don't leave just because you hang up the uniform for a few weeks. My eyes opened at 0500 sharp and immediate, before the alarm even had a chance to vibrate on the nightstand. For a few seconds I lay there listening to the old house breathe around me. The pipes knocked somewhere behind the wall. A truck passed outside its tires hissing against damp pavement. From downstairs came the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint, uneven snore of my brother on the couch. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the night before. $70,000. That number still sat in my mind like a stone. I had money saved. Not because life had been easy, but because I'd spent years living out of duffel bags, eating in chow halls, missing birthdays, funerals, holidays, and ordinary Sundays that other people took for granted. I had earned every dollar in that account, one deployment, one missed Christmas, one aching night at a time. Jason had earned his debt at sports bars and backroom poker games. And somehow in my father's mind, those two things belonged on the same scale. I pushed the blanket off and sat up. The room still looked like it had when I was 17, except colder. My old track ribbons were gone, but the nail holes remained above the dresser. A cardboard box of my mother's things sat in the corner untouched since the funeral. On top of the dresser was the small wooden box my grandfather had given me. I always checked it when I came home. Not because I thought anyone would touch it. Because seeing it steadied me. I crossed the room barefoot, lifted the box gently, and ran my thumb over the carved initials on the lid, R.C. Robert Carter. My grandfather's hands had been old and trembling when he gave it to me, but his voice had still carried command. Don't ever let people use the word family to steal your self-respect. I opened the lid. The box was empty. At first, my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. I stood perfectly still, staring into the velvet lining where the bronze star had rested for years. The indentation was still there, a faint outline in dark blue fabric. But the metal itself was gone. For one strange suspended moment, I thought maybe I had moved it. Maybe I had taken it out and forgotten. Maybe I'd packed it somewhere safer. Then I saw the dust mark, a clean rectangle on the dresser where the box had been shifted and placed back carelessly. My body went cold before my thoughts caught up. I walked out of the room with the box in my hand. Downstairs, Dad was in the kitchen pouring coffee. Jason was awake too, hunched over the table with bloodshot eyes, scrolling through his phone like a man waiting for a verdict. Dad saw the box first. Then he saw my face. He didn't look surprised. That told me everything. Where is it? I asked. Jason glanced up, then looked away fast. Dad took a sip of coffee. Morning to you too. Where is it? He set the mug down with exaggerated patience, like I was a child making noise before breakfast. Emily, lower your voice. I stepped into the kitchen. The house smelled like burned coffee and old grease. Morning light cut through the blinds in thin yellow stripes across the table. Jason's knee bounced under it. I held up the box. Where is my grandfather's medal? My father sighed. Not guilty. Not ashamed. Annoyed. I sold it. The words landed so cleanly, so simply that for a second I didn't move. Jason kept staring at his phone. I heard the clock above the stove tick once. Then again. You what? Dad leaned back against the counter. I sold it. My fingers tightened around the edge of the box. That wasn't yours. It was in my house. It was mine. It was your grandfather's, he corrected sharply. And before you start acting dramatic, he was my father. I stared at him. I had seen men lie under pressure. I had seen soldiers panic. I had seen commanders make terrible decisions and still try to stand tall afterward. But this was different. This was a man who had convinced himself that theft was leadership. "You sold a military decoration," I said slowly, "that was legally given to me." Dad waved his hand. "Don't start with all that legal nonsense. Some collector offered good money for it." "How much?" He hesitated. That hesitation hurt almost as much as the act itself. "How much?" I repeated. 12,000. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You sold my grandfather's bronze star for $12,000. Jason muttered. It helped. I turned on him. He shrank slightly, but not enough. "It helped," I said. "You owed $70,000 and he sold the one thing Grandpa left me so you could cover what interest?" Jason's face reddened. "You don't know what kind of pressure I'm under." "No," I said. "I know exactly what pressure is. Pressure is calling home from a desert base and pretending you're fine so your family doesn't worry. Pressure is standing in formation beside an empty pair of boots. Pressure is earning something you can't buy." Dad slammed his mug down. "That's enough." But I wasn't looking at him anymore. I was looking at the empty box. I could feel my grandfather's absence in it. That was the only way I can describe it. Some objects hold weight beyond their size. That metal had held his voice, his hand on my shoulder, his belief in me when nobody else in that house cared enough to look. And my father had traded it away like a watch at a pawn shop. Finally, I looked back at him. "Who bought it?" Dad's jaw tightened. "None of your business. It became my business when you stole from me." His eyes flashed. "Don't you stand in my kitchen and call me a thief. Then don't steal." Jason pushed back from the table. "Emily, come on. Dad was just trying to help." I turned toward him fully. "No, Dad was trying to avoid letting you face consequences." Dad pointed at me. "You think that uniform makes you better than us?" I said nothing. "You think because you got medals and a salary and everybody claps when you walk through airports, you don't owe this family anything?" My throat tightened, but my voice stayed even. "I owe this family honesty. I owe basic respect. I don't owe $70,000. And I don't owe silence while you sell what doesn't belong to you." Dad laughed. It was small, bitter, and ugly. "Your grandfather would understand." That was the sentence that almost broke my control. Not the theft. Not the money. That. I stepped closer until only the kitchen table stood between us. "Don't use him to justify this." Dad folded his arms, suddenly looking pleased that he had found the wound. "He knew what sacrifice meant. Maybe you forgot." I watched him smile. Then he said it. "Sacrifice is part of family." Jason looked relieved, like the phrase had settled everything. Dad lifted his coffee again. But I just stood there. No yelling. No crying. No trembling. Something very quiet opened inside me. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel like his daughter. I felt like a witness. I closed the empty box. The sound was soft, but both of them heard it. Dad frowned. "What are you doing?" I turned and walked toward the hallway. "Emily." I kept walking. "Emily, don't be childish." I stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked back. "You should have asked me." Dad scoffed. "And you would have said no." "Yes," I said, "I would have." Then I went upstairs, put on jeans boots and my army field jacket, and carried the wooden box out to the garage. The air inside was cold and smelled like motor oil and dust. I sat behind the wheel of my truck, shut the door, and held the box in my lap. For a moment, I let myself breathe. Not cry. Just breathe. Then I took out my phone and made the call. The first person I contacted was Colonel Denise Whitaker, my commanding officer, and one of the few people I trusted without hesitation. She answered on the third ring, her voice crisp even before 6 in the morning. "Carter." "Ma'am," I said. "I need guidance on reporting a stolen military decoration." There was a pause. Then her tone changed. "Whose decoration?" "My grandfather's. General Robert Carter, Bronze Star, transferred to me personally before his death." Another pause, longer this time. "Was it taken from your possession?" "Yes, ma'am." "By whom?" I looked through the windshield at the kitchen window. Dad stood inside talking with Jason, both of them already moving on with their morning like nothing had happened. "My father." Colonel Whitaker exhaled once. "Do you know where it is now?" "Sold to a collector." "Do you have documentation?" "Yes." "Then listen carefully, Major. You are going to file a police report. You are going to preserve every message, every record, every witness statement. And Emily..." "Yes, ma'am." Her voice softened just slightly. "Do not let them talk you out of this." After I hung up, I sat in the truck for another full minute. Then I called the local police department. The officer on the line asked for my name, the item, the estimated value, and whether I believed the sale had been unauthorized. I answered each question clearly. When he asked if the person responsible was a family member, I looked down at the wooden box. Yes, I said, but that doesn't change what he did. By that evening, my father and brother were drinking beer in the living room. Jason laughed too loudly at something on TV. Dad sat in his recliner acting like the king of a house built on unpaid bills and old resentments. Neither one apologized. Neither one asked if I was okay. To them, my silence meant surrender. They didn't understand that silence can also be preparation. I went to bed with the empty box beside me. And the next morning before the coffee finished brewing, the front door shook under the weight of a fist. Police opened the door, Souther didn't move at first. The knocking came again, harder this time, a flat official sound that seemed to split the house down the middle. "Mr. Carter, this is the police, open the door." Jason stood near the couch with his mouth slightly open, one hand still wrapped around his phone. He looked younger in that moment. Not innocent, just small. All the swagger he carried when asking for money had drained out of him, leaving behind a man who suddenly understood that consequences could have uniforms too. Dad slowly turned from the front door to me. "What did you do?" he asked again. I stood near the hallway with my arms relaxed at my sides. My hair was pulled back. My boots were already on. I had not slept much, but I had slept enough. Enough to know that what was happening was not revenge in the way my father would understand it. It was correction. "I made a report," I said. Dad's face hardened instantly. "You called the cops on your own father." Before I could answer, the officer outside knocked again. "Open the door now." Dad cursed under his breath and walked to the entryway. His shoulders were stiff, his steps heavy, but I could see the hesitation in the way his hand hovered over the lock. He had spent his entire life acting like rules were things that applied to other people. Now the rules were standing on his porch. He opened the door. 2 uniformed officers stood outside. Behind them was a woman in a dark blazer with short gray hair and a badge clipped at her belt. Her posture told me she had been military before she ever introduced herself. Straight spine, calm eyes, no wasted movement. "Frank Carter," one officer asked. Dad lifted his chin. "That's me. I'm Officer Daniels. This is Officer Perez. We need to speak with you regarding a reported theft and unauthorized sale of military property." Dad gave a dry laugh. "Military property. You people must be confused." The woman in the blazer stepped forward. "I don't think we are." Her eyes moved past him and landed on me. "Major Carter." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Special Investigator Helen Reeves. I spoke with Colonel Whitaker this morning." Dad looked between us. "Major Investigator, what the hell is this?" Officer Daniels stepped inside. "May we come in?" Dad started to say no, but then he saw the folder in Investigator Reeves's hand. Something in his expression shifted. Not guilt yet. Just calculation. He stepped back. The living room suddenly looked worse with law enforcement in it. Beer cans on the side table, stained carpet. Jason's bedding slips folded under a coaster. Family pictures on the wall, all of us pretending to be closer than we ever were. Investigator Reeves looked around once, then turned to my father. "Mr. Carter, we're here about a Bronze Star Medal awarded to General Robert Carter and later transferred by signed document to Major Emily Carter." Dad crossed his arms. It was my father's medal. That was not my question. His jaw tightened. Reeves opened the folder. "Did you sell the medal?" Dad glanced at Jason. Jason looked away. That alone was answer enough. Dad cleared his throat. "I sold an old family item, yes. Who did you sell it to?" "A collector." "Name?" "I don't remember." I watched him lie with the same tone he used when telling bill collectors the check was in the mail. Investigator Reeves did not blink. "That's unfortunate because the collector remembers you." For the first time, Jason made a sound, not a word, more like air leaving a punctured tire. Dad's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means Mr. Harold Benson contacted local authorities after learning the medal may have been sold without legal authorization. He also provided a receipt." Dad's face lost a little color. I hadn't expected that. I knew the police would investigate, but I hadn't known the buyer had already cooperated. A strange calm moved through me. Not joy, not satisfaction, just the steady feeling of a door locking behind the truth. Officer Perez pulled a small notebook from her pocket. "Mr. Benson stated you claimed full ownership of the item." Dad's mouth opened, then closed. "He also stated you told him your daughter was deceased." The room went silent. For one moment, even the refrigerator seemed to stop humming. Jason whispered, "Dad." I felt something cold move through my chest. Not surprise, worse than surprise. Confirmation. My father had not just sold the metal, he had erased me to make the sale easier. I looked at him waiting for him to deny it. He didn't. He pointed at me instead. She wouldn't help her brother, he said. Jason was in trouble. Real trouble. I did what I had to do. Officer Daniels looked unimpressed. By claiming your living daughter was dead. Dad's eyes flashed. You don't understand family. That sentence almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, because it was so perfectly him. Investigator Reeves closed the folder halfway. Mr. Carter family does not give you legal ownership over another adult's property. Dad turned toward me, anger rising now because shame had nowhere else to go. You hear that? You happy. You dragged strangers into this house to humiliate me. I took one step forward. No, you did that when you sold what wasn't yours. Jason suddenly found his voice. Emily, come on. This is insane. We can fix this. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. I looked at my brother. His hair was messy. His hands shook slightly. He had always been able to become pitiful at exactly the right moment, like a child holding up a broken toy he had smashed himself. A misunderstanding, I asked. He nodded too quickly. Yeah, Dad didn't mean anything bad. He was trying to help me. And that has always been the problem. Jason frowned. I turned to the officers, then back to my father and brother. For years, everything in this family has been renamed to protect Jason. Gambling became stress. Lying became panic. Stealing became sacrifice. And me paying for it became love. Dad barked enough. But I didn't stop. When Jason needed rent, I paid it. When his truck got repossessed, I helped get it back. When Mom was sick and you said you couldn't handle bills alone, I sent money from overseas. I missed her last good Thanksgiving because I was deployed, and still somehow I was the selfish one. My voice did not rise. That made it worse for them. Because every word landed clean. Jason stared at the carpet. Dad's breathing grew heavier. You trained me to believe being a good daughter meant bleeding quietly, I said. But I am not bleeding for this anymore. Investigator Reeves watched me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she turned to my father. Mr. Carter, we need the full details of the sale. Depending on the documentation and intent, this may involve theft, fraud, and filing a false ownership claim. Dad suddenly looked at Officer Daniels. Am I being arrested? Not at this moment, Daniels said, but you are being asked to cooperate. At this moment, Jason repeated weakly. Officer Perez's gaze moved to him. And we'll need to discuss the financial circumstances connected to the sale. Jason swallowed. That was when he understood this was no longer only about the metal. The debt was no longer hidden inside family walls. The calls, the threats, the money, the lies, all of it had stepped into daylight. Dad gripped the back of his recliner. This is a family matter. Investigator Reeves's face remained calm. No, Mr. Carter. It stopped being only a family matter when you sold a military decoration using false information. Then she looked at me. And when the rightful owner chose not to stay silent. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Rain had started outside, tapping softly against the windows. The house smelled of coffee left too long on the burner. Somewhere in that quiet, I remembered my grandfather sitting on the porch telling me that honor was not loud. It was what you did when nobody else wanted the truth spoken. Dad looked at me then, not as his daughter, not as someone he could order around, but as a person with rank records rights and a spine he had mistaken for silence. His mouth twisted. You think your grandfather would be proud of this? Before I could answer, Investigator Reeves did. I never met General Carter personally, she said. But my father did. Iraq, 2004. He told me General Carter pulled 3 men out of a burning convoy and refused to leave until every soldier was accounted for. My father blinked. Reeves held his gaze. My father said he was the kind of man who knew the difference between sacrifice and exploitation. The words settled over the room like a verdict. Dad looked away first. Jason sat down slowly on the arm of the couch, suddenly pale. And I stood there holding an empty wooden box, finally understanding that my grandfather's legacy had never been inside the metal alone. It had been inside the courage to protect it. For the next 3 days, the house felt like a building after a fire. Still standing, but damaged in ways nobody could ignore. My father barely spoke to me unless he absolutely had to. When he did, his voice carried that tight, bitter restraint people use when they know rage won't help them anymore. Jason spent most of his time locked in the basement, pretending he was looking for work, though. Every few hours, another unknown number lit up his phone and sent him pacing like a trapped animal. The police had not arrested anyone yet, but the investigation was active. The collector who bought the metal had surrendered it voluntarily once he realized the ownership papers were fraudulent. Investigator Reeves informed me it would remain in evidence temporarily before being returned. My father called that government nonsense. I called it accountability. But beneath the tension, something else had begun happening inside that house. Fear. Not loud fear. The quiet kind. The kind that settles into the walls when people realize old family patterns no longer work. Dad couldn't order me around anymore. Guilt no longer moved me. Silence no longer protected him. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to control the situation. On the fourth morning, I found him sitting alone at the kitchen table before sunrise. No television. No coffee. Just him staring at a stack of overdue bills under the yellow light above the stove. He looked older than he had a week earlier. Not physically. Spiritually? Like something foundational inside him had started collapsing. I moved toward the coffee maker quietly, but his voice stopped me. You think you won. I kept my back turned while pouring coffee. This isn't about winning. That's easy to say when everybody's treating you like some hero. I looked over my shoulder. No one's treating me like a hero. He gave a dry laugh. That investigator practically saluted you. She respected the truth. Dad shook his head slowly. No, he muttered. She respected the uniform. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Because part of me knew he believed it. My father had spent his whole life dismissing things he didn't understand. Discipline, boundaries, emotional restraint. To him, authority only mattered when it served him directly. The army represented everything he secretly resented: structure, accountability, consequences. And maybe deep down he hated that I belonged to something bigger than this family. I took my coffee to the table and sat across from him. The rain from yesterday had left the windows fogged pale gray. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started in the distance. Dad rubbed a hand across his jaw. Jason's scared. I stared at him. Not because the statement surprised me. Because even now, after everything, Jason was still the center of gravity in his mind. What about you? I asked quietly. He frowned slightly. What about me? Are you scared? For a second, his eyes flickered. Then pride sealed the crack shut. I'm angry. Of course he was. Anger was easier than guilt. Before I could answer, headlights swept across the kitchen wall through the window. A black sedan pulled slowly into the driveway. Dad stiffened immediately. A minute later, there was a knock at the door. Not police this time. Measured, professional. I opened it to find a tall man in a navy overcoat carrying a leather briefcase. Major Carter. Yes. He offered a polite nod. My name is Walter Green. I was General Robert Carter's attorney. Everything inside me went still. Behind me, I heard my father stand up sharply. Green stepped inside, carefully removing rain from his glasses with a folded handkerchief. He looked to be in his late 60s, silver-haired and composed in the way old attorneys often are when they've spent decades watching families tear themselves apart over inheritance. I apologize for arriving unannounced, he said, but recent events made this conversation necessary. Dad folded his arms instantly. What conversation? Mr. Green looked at him evenly. One your father instructed me to have if certain circumstances ever occurred. The kitchen became very quiet. I slowly sat back down. Green opened his briefcase and removed a thick sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in my grandfather's handwriting. Emily. Just seeing it nearly took the air from my lungs. Dad stepped forward. What is that? Green ignored him. Your grandfather left specific instructions regarding his military effects, Major Carter. He was concerned they might eventually become the subject of financial coercion. Dad's face darkened instantly. That old man never trusted his own family. Green finally looked at him directly. With respect, Mr. Carter, he trusted the right people exactly as much as he intended to. That landed harder than shouting would have. Dad's jaw tightened. I picked up the envelope carefully. My grandfather's handwriting looked shakier than I remembered, but unmistakable. Suddenly I could smell his aftershave again. Hear the scrape of his cane across the porch boards. Feel his rough hand against my shoulder. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a letter, and another set of legal documents. My eyes moved first to the letter. Emily, if you are reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either this family has finally asked too much from you, or you have finally stopped giving it. I swallowed hard. Across the table, my father shifted uncomfortably. Your father and brother are not evil people. But weakness repeated long enough becomes cruelty. And the cruelest thing this family ever did to you was convince you that love must always cost you something. The kitchen blurred slightly. I blinked once and kept reading. You were born carrying responsibility that never belonged to you. I watched it happen for years. Every time Jason failed, you were expected to compensate. Every time Frank struggled, you were expected to absorb the damage quietly. That is not sacrifice. That is consumption. Dad suddenly snapped, "What exactly is this supposed to accomplish?" Mr. Green answered calmly, "Your father wanted his granddaughter to understand the truth." "The truth," Dad barked. "The truth is I kept this family together." "No," I said softly before I even realized I was speaking. "You kept finding someone else to carry it." The room fell silent again. I looked back at the letter. "I have paid your father's debts more times than he knows. I covered Jason's mistakes more times than he deserved. But eventually I understood something painful. Rescuing people from consequences only teaches them to keep creating disasters." My hands tightened slightly on the paper. Then I reached the final section. "There is also a trust." My father straightened instantly. Mr. Green opened the second folder. "General Carter established a private trust in Emily's name approximately 8 years ago." Jason appeared silently in the doorway behind us, pale and exhausted. Dad stared at the attorney. "How much?" Green didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me. "The trust was never meant to reward service alone," he said carefully. "Your grandfather attached a condition." I frowned. "What condition?" Green's expression softened slightly. "That the funds only transfer fully once you demonstrated the willingness to stop sacrificing your own stability to sustain destructive family patterns." My father let out a sharp laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." But Mr. Green slid the documents across the table anyway. I looked down at the number and suddenly understood why my grandfather had protected it so carefully. It wasn't millionaire fantasy money, but it was enough. Enough to erase every debt I personally carried. Enough to buy a home. Enough to breathe. Jason whispered, "Jesus." Dad looked furious now, but underneath the anger was something uglier. Humiliation. "You planned this," he snapped at me. I looked up slowly. "No, Grandpa did." "He turned you against us." "No," I said quietly. "He tried to save me from becoming responsible for everyone forever." Dad shoved a hand through his hair and paced toward the sink. "All this because I sold some damn metal." "No," Mr. Green corrected gently. "Because the metal revealed the truth." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Jason suddenly grabbed his jacket. "I gotta go." Dad turned sharply. "Where?" Jason avoided everyone's eyes. "Out." "You can't just leave right now." But Jason was already backing toward the door. Because for the first time in his life, there was no one left between him and the consequences waiting outside. The door slammed behind him. Dad looked exhausted suddenly. Old. Smaller than I had ever seen him. And as I sat there holding my grandfather's final letter, I realized something painful. Part of me had spent my entire life waiting for my father to become someone else. Someone softer. Kinder. Fair. But grief has a strange way of clearing illusions. Some people never change. Some people only run out of power. 2 weeks later, the medal came back to me in a padded evidence envelope. Investigator Reeves met me at the police station on a Thursday afternoon, just as the sky was turning the color of old steel. She handed it over with both hands, not because procedure required it, but because she understood what it was. "Mr. Benson signed a statement," she said. "He didn't know it was stolen. Once he realized, he cooperated fully." I nodded. "What happens now?" She studied me for a moment. "That depends partly on the district attorney. Your father may face charges related to theft and fraud. The false ownership claim complicates things." I looked down at the envelope. For a long time I had imagined that getting the medal back would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt heavier than that. Like receiving back a piece of something after someone had tried to prove it could be taken. "Are you all right?" Major Reeves asked. I almost gave the automatic answer. "Yes, ma'am." "Fine, ma'am." Instead, I said, "I don't know yet." She nodded once, like she respected that more than a polished lie. That evening, I drove home slowly. The old neighborhood rolled past my windows, split-level houses, American flags, porch lights glowing in the early dark. A man across the street was dragging his trash cans to the curb. Somewhere, someone was grilling. Ordinary life continued, careless and steady. But my life had shifted. The house was quiet when I walked in. Jason was gone. No one knew exactly where. Dad said he had needed space, but I knew better. The calls had grown more threatening. The men Jason owed had stopped leaving polite messages. He had finally done what he always did when pressure became real. He ran. Dad sat in the living room, the television on mute. His face looked hollow in the blue light. There were unopened envelopes on the coffee table and a glass of whiskey beside his chair. He looked up when I came in. His eyes went immediately to the envelope in my hand. They gave it back. Yes, he swallowed. For a second I thought he might apologize. But pride is a stubborn disease. I hope it was worth it, he said. I stood in the doorway too tired to be angry. That's what you still don't understand, I said. You think this was about punishing you. What else would it be about? I walked to the mantel where an old photograph of my grandfather still stood in a tarnished frame. He was younger in the picture, wearing dress blues, his posture straight, his expression severe. But I remembered the man behind the portrait, the one who slipped peppermints into my coat pocket, the one who watched my track meets even when his knees hurt too badly to climb the bleachers. I opened the envelope and held the medal carefully in my palm. It caught the lamplight in a muted bronze glow. This was about stopping you, I said. Dad's face tightened. Stopping me. Yes, stopping you from deciding that my life, my money, my memories, and my boundaries were all available whenever Jason needed saving. His mouth opened, but no words came. I placed the medal on the mantel beside Grandpa's photograph. For a moment the room felt almost sacred. Then Dad spoke lower this time. I was trying to keep this family together. I turned back to him. No, Dad. You were trying to keep a system together, one where Jason destroys you, excuse, and I repair. He flinched, but I kept my voice calm. I know you loved Mom. I know losing her broke something in you. I know Jason scared you because he was weak in ways you didn't know how to fix. I know maybe helping him made you feel like you still mattered. His eyes reddened slightly. But you turned me into the price. The words sat between us. He looked away first. For the first time I saw not a monster, not a villain, not the giant shadow I had spent years trying to outrun. I saw an aging man who had confused control with love for so long that he no longer knew how to separate them. That did not make what he did acceptable. It only made it sadder. A few days later he came to see me at the small rental house I had taken near base. I had moved out quietly before dawn with 2 duffel bags, my documents, my grandfather's letter, and the medal locked safely in a case. Dad stood on my porch wearing the same brown jacket he had worn to my mother's funeral. He looked uncomfortable there, like a man visiting a country where he didn't speak the language. Can I come in, he asked. I hesitated. Then I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. His face changed when he understood. He wasn't getting access just because he was my father. Not anymore. We stood under the porch light while cold wind moved through the trees. He cleared his throat. Jason called. I said nothing. He's in Tennessee, I think, said he needs help. I watched him carefully. And Dad's jaw worked. I told him I couldn't. That surprised me more than I wanted it to. He looked down at his hands. First time I ever said it. For a moment I saw the cost of it in his face. Not enough to erase the past, not enough to undo the theft, but enough to prove that even men like my father could feel the edge of truth when it finally cut deep. I'm glad, I said softly. His eyes lifted. Does that change anything between us? I took a breath. The answer hurt. Number. He nodded slowly like he had expected it and still hoped he was wrong. I don't know how to fix this, he said. You don't fix it by asking me to come back. I know. You don't fix it by needing forgiveness before you've changed. His shoulders dropped. I know. The wind moved again, carrying the faint smell of pine and distant rain. Then he asked the question I had feared. Can you forgive me? I looked past him toward the dark street. For years I had believed forgiveness meant opening the door again, answering the call, sending the money, pretending the wound had closed because everyone else was tired of looking at it. But that night I finally understood something my grandfather had tried to teach me. Forgiveness is not permission, and peace does not require returning to the place that broke you. I'm working on letting go of what you did, I said, but I'm not giving you my life back. Dad closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked older. I'm sorry, Emily. It was the first real apology I had ever heard from him. No explanation, no accusation, no but, just sorry. I nodded once. Not acceptance, not rejection, just acknowledgement. Then I went back inside and locked the door. Months later, I stood in my new home wearing my dress uniform before a memorial dinner honoring my grandfather's service. The medal rested in a glass case on the wall beside his letter, not hidden in a drawer, not waiting for someone else to decide its worth. Protected. I touched the glass lightly before leaving. For the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty for having peace. I did not feel selfish for having boundaries. And I did not feel cruel for refusing to pay the debts of people who had mistaken my love for an open bank account. My grandfather once told me that honor was not something pinned to your chest. It was something you defended when the people closest to you tried to convince you it was negotiable. He was right. Some families will call your silence loyalty. Some will call your suffering love. Some will steal from you, then accuse you of betrayal when you finally protect yourself. But the day you stop handing them the knife is not the day you become heartless. It is the day you come home to yourself. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to choose peace over family pressure. There are more stories like this coming every day, so subscribe and stay with us. Sometimes the strongest revenge is not destroying the people who hurt you. Sometimes it is simply walking away with your dignity still intact. The moment my brother looked across the lawyer's office and smirked at me, I knew he believed he had already won. He leaned back in our father's chair like he owned the entire town, one arm stretched across the polished wood table, while relatives sat around him pretending not to stare at me. I still had dust on my army boots from the flight home. I hadn't even unpacked my duffel bag yet. Daniel smiled slowly and said, "Guess all that military training should help you survive on the streets." A couple of my cousins laughed under their breath. Then he slid the house keys into his pocket. I remember the exact sound they made. Metal against denim. Like a prison door closing. I stood there in the same black dress I'd worn to bury both my parents 3 days earlier, staring at the only family I had left, and realizing none of them intended to stop him. Then the lawyer cleared his throat, and everything changed, because my father had left behind one final secret. And before that meeting was over, my brother would collapse right onto the hardwood floor. But 3 days earlier, I still believed grief was the worst pain a person could survive. I had no idea what waited for me when I came home. The town looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed driving past Miller's gas station and the faded diner near Route 16. The old water tower still leaned slightly to one side, and the church bell still rang every hour like it had when I was a little girl. Everything looked frozen in time, except me. I'd spent 16 years in the Army. Most of my adult life had been measured by deployments, training schedules, sandstorms, aircraft engines, and the sound of boots hitting concrete before sunrise. Overseas time moved violently. Back home, it barely moved at all. Rain streaked across my windshield as I drove toward the family house for the first time since the funeral. My parents were gone. Even thinking those words still felt unnatural. My mother had died first after a long fight with heart disease. My father followed 11 days later. The doctors called it a stroke, but deep down I think his heart simply stopped seeing a reason to keep going. I parked beside the familiar white fence and sat there gripping the steering wheel. The porch light was on. For one stupid second, my brain tried convincing me Mom might still open the front door with a dish towel over her shoulder, asking why I looked so thin. Instead, Daniel opened it. My older brother filled the doorway with that same heavy posture he'd had since high school football made him believe size alone could intimidate people. He crossed his arms when he saw me. "You finally made it," he said. No hug. No warmth. Just accusation. I got here as fast as I could. "Funeral's over." The words hit harder than I expected. Rain tapped against the truck roof while I stared at him. "I know." Daniel shrugged. "People have jobs, lives. They couldn't wait around forever." I climbed out carrying my duffel bag. My knees ached from 20 hours of travel and too many years jumping in and out of military vehicles. Every muscle in my body felt older than 42. The moment I stepped inside the house, something felt wrong. The living room had been rearranged. Mom's piano was gone. The framed military photo my father kept above the fireplace had disappeared too. I stopped cold. "Where's Mom's piano?" Daniel walked into the kitchen without answering. "Sold it." I stared after him. "What?" "She wasn't using it anymore." My stomach tightened. That piano had belonged to our grandmother. Mom used to play old gospel songs on Sunday mornings while Dad drank coffee and read the paper. "You sold it already." Daniel opened the refrigerator. "We need money." He shut the fridge harder than necessary. "I paid for everything around here while you were off playing soldier." There it was. The same resentment that had followed me my entire life. When I enlisted at 22, Daniel called it selfish. When I deployed overseas, he said I cared more about strangers than family. When Dad proudly hung my military portrait in the hallway, Daniel stopped visiting for nearly 2 months. Nothing I ever did could erase the fact that our father respected me. And Daniel hated me for it. I carried my bag upstairs slowly. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish. But even up there, pieces of my parents were already disappearing. My mother's closet was half empty. Dad's watch collection was gone. Drawers stood open. It didn't feel like mourning. It felt like looting. That night I found Daniel sitting alone at the kitchen table drinking bourbon from Dad's old glass tumbler. "You changed the locks?" I asked quietly. He didn't even look embarrassed. "Yeah." I stared at him. "Why?" "Because this house is mine now. The will hasn't even been read yet." "It doesn't need to be." He took another drink. "Dad always said the house would stay with me." I leaned against the counter exhausted. "I didn't come here to fight with you." "No," he muttered. "You came because now there's something to inherit." The accusation burned because part of me feared everyone in town believed it. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, hospital visits. I wasn't there when Mom first got sick. I wasn't there when Dad started forgetting names. Military service demanded sacrifice, and sometimes the people back home paid for it too. But what Daniel never understood was that I sacrificed those moments because I believed protecting people mattered, including them. "I sent money every month," I said carefully, "for years." He laughed bitterly. "Money doesn't replace showing up." Silence settled between us. Thunder rolled outside. Finally, Daniel stood and grabbed my duffel bag from beside the stairs. "What are you doing?" "You can stay tonight," he said. "Tomorrow you need to figure something else out." I thought I misheard him. "Excuse me." "You heard me." "Daniel, this is my home too." "No." His voice sharpened. "It stopped being your home when you left." He walked to the front door and tossed my bag onto the wet porch. Army training teaches you how to react under pressure. Gunfire, explosions, ambushes. You learn how to stay calm when your pulse is screaming. But nothing in 16 years prepared me for standing in my childhood home while my own brother threw me out like garbage 3 days after we buried our parents. "You're serious," I whispered. Daniel opened the door wider. "Guess all that military training should help you survive out there." For a moment I truly thought about hitting him. Not because I hated him, because I suddenly realized he had been waiting years for this moment. Years. I picked up my duffel bag slowly. The rain soaked through my jacket instantly. Daniel closed the door behind me without another word. I stood there staring at the porch light through the storm, listening to the deadbolt click into place. Home. Gone. By midnight, I was parked outside a rundown motel near the interstate. Neon lights flickered outside my windshield while 18-wheelers roared through the darkness. I reclined the truck seat and pulled my army jacket over myself like a blanket. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, my phone rang. The screen showed the name Harold Bennett. "My father's attorney," I answered groggily. "Hello?" His voice sounded unusually tense. "Emily, I need you at the office Friday morning for the official reading of the will." I closed my eyes. "Fine." There was a pause. Then he said quietly, "Your father insisted you be there in person, no matter what your brother says." Something in his tone made me sit upright. Outside rain hammered the windshield harder. And for the first time since coming home, I felt the faintest sense that my father had known something before he died. Something important. I woke before sunrise out of pure habit. For a few disoriented seconds I reached for a rifle that wasn't there and listened for the familiar sounds of a military base waking up around me. Instead, I heard rainwater dripping from a broken motel gutter and the low hum of truck engines on the interstate. Then reality returned. My parents were dead. My brother had thrown me out, and I was sleeping in the front seat of my pickup truck like a drifter passing through town. I sat upright slowly, my back stiff from the cramped position. Cold fog clouded the windshield. My duffel bag rested beside me, half unzipped, with army uniforms folded inside like relics from another life. At 42 years old, after 16 years of military service, 2 combat deployments, and enough medals to fill a drawer I never opened anymore, I suddenly had nowhere to go. The thought should have humiliated me more than it did. Instead, I mostly felt tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after grief strips away your anger. I drove toward the diner near Route 16 because it opened at 5 and because Mom used to take me there after church when I was little. The parking lot was nearly empty except for an old Ford truck with a Purple Heart sticker on the bumper. The smell of bacon and burnt coffee wrapped around me the moment I stepped inside. A few people looked up. I recognized almost all of them. And every single face carried that same uncomfortable expression people wear around tragedy. Too much pity. Too much curiosity. "Emily Carter," the waitress whispered. I nodded politely. "Well, goodness," she touched her chest. "We heard you came home." Home. Funny word. I ordered coffee and sat near the window. Halfway through my first cup, an older man approached, slowly using a cane. Frank Delaney. Vietnam veteran? I hadn't seen him in nearly 15 years. Captain Carter, he said with a crooked smile. I stood automatically out of respect. Mr. Delaney. He shook his head. Frank. His wife Margaret appeared behind him, carrying 2 slices of pie nobody had ordered. You look exhausted, she said softly. That nearly broke me. Not the funeral. Not Daniel. A 70-year-old woman saying you look exhausted with genuine kindness in her voice. I swallowed hard. Long trip. Frank sat across from me without asking permission. Veterans do that sometimes. We recognize each other before words even happen. You staying somewhere decent? I hesitated 1 second too long. Margaret exchanged a glance with her husband. Then Frank said quietly, You can stay with us? I started to protest immediately. No, I couldn't. You could, he interrupted, and you will. That was how I ended up in their guest bedroom later that morning, staring at a handmade quilt while sunlight crept through old curtains. Margaret left folded towels on the bed like I was family. I almost cried again, not because I was weak, because kindness feels overwhelming when humiliation has hollowed you out first. Over the next 2 days, the town reminded me exactly how quickly people choose sides. Everywhere I went, I heard the same version of the story. Daniel stayed. Emily left. Daniel took care of the parents. Emily chased a military career. Daniel sacrificed. Emily abandoned the family. None of it was completely true. None of it was completely false either. That's what made it hurt. At the grocery store, one of Mom's church friends squeezed my arm sympathetically and said, Your brother really carried the burden these last few years. I nodded quietly. At the gas station, an old classmate asked, You staying long or heading back overseas? Like I was a temporary visitor in my own hometown. Even my Aunt Linda cornered me outside the pharmacy. You know, she said carefully, your brother gave up a lot staying here. I looked at her for a long moment. So did I. She smiled awkwardly. Of course, I just mean, parents need someone physically present. Physically present. The phrase followed me everywhere. Nobody saw the bank transfers I made every month. Nobody saw the nights I stayed awake in Afghanistan calculating how to pay Mom's medical bills from the middle of a desert. Nobody knew Dad called me after midnight crying quietly because he was scared of forgetting things. And nobody knew Daniel had access to every single account. That part stayed hidden, at least for now. Late Thursday afternoon, I drove past the house again. Construction trucks sat in the driveway. I pulled over immediately. 2 men carried furniture through the front door while Daniel stood outside talking into his phone. He spotted me and rolled his eyes before hanging up. What's all this? Renovations. I stared at him. Mom died 2 weeks ago. So maybe wait before tearing apart the house. Daniel shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. I'm getting it ready to sell. The words hit like a slap. Sell. Property taxes are insane. Besides, there's no reason keeping a giant house. I looked toward Dad's workshop through the side window. Did Dad know you planned this? Daniel smirked slightly. Dad's dead, Emily. Something dark moved behind his eyes when he said it. Not grief, relief. For the first time in my life, I realized my brother might not simply resent me. He might genuinely hate me. I took a slow breath. Harold called. The will reading's tomorrow. Daniel snorted. Formalities. You seem pretty confident. Because I lived here. He stepped closer. You disappeared for 16 years and suddenly expect equal treatment. I never expected anything. That's funny, he muttered. Town seems to think you came back for money. I should have walked away. Instead, I asked the question sitting in the back of my mind for days. Did you ever tell them I paid Mom's hospital bills? His expression changed instantly. Just for a second. Then it disappeared. You sent a little money. A little... You think wiring checks makes you a daughter? He snapped. You weren't here when Mom couldn't walk to the bathroom. You weren't here when Dad started forgetting where he lived. His voice cracked slightly. Real pain lived there beneath the bitterness. That was the tragedy of Daniel Carter. He wasn't a monster. He was a wounded man who let resentment rot everything good inside him. I know I missed things, I said quietly. You missed everything. Silence stretched between us while workers carried another box outside. Then I noticed something sitting near the garage. Dad's American flag, folded carelessly beside paint cans. The same flag presented to my father during his funeral service. Something inside me hardened instantly. I walked toward it. Daniel grabbed my arm. Leave it. I looked down slowly at his hand gripping my sleeve. Military instincts don't disappear. My body reacted before emotion did. One twist, one sharp movement, and Daniel stumbled backward off balance. The workers froze. Daniel stared at me in shock. I picked up the flag carefully and held it against my chest. "You don't put this on the ground," I said softly. His face turned red with humiliation. For a moment I saw the old Daniel, the insecure younger brother forever competing with someone he thought Dad loved more. Then his expression became cold again. "You always think you're better than everyone." "No," I replied. "I just think some things should still matter." I drove away before my anger got louder than my grief. That night, Frank found me sitting alone on his back porch, watching lightning bugs flicker across the fields. "You're carrying too much guilt," he said quietly. I stared into the darkness. Maybe I deserve some of it. Frank leaned back in his chair. "Combat teaches people strange lessons. One of the worst is believing sacrifice only counts if someone witnessed it." I looked at him. He nodded slowly. "Your parents knew who you were, Emily." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But deep down, I still feared tomorrow's will reading would prove Daniel right. That maybe staying mattered more than loving. And maybe I had already lost my family long before they died. The next morning, I stood outside Harold Bennett's law office wearing my dark blue dress uniform jacket over civilian clothes. Not for pride. For armor. Across the street, Daniel climbed out of his truck laughing with two cousins. Completely relaxed. Completely certain he'd already won. Harold Bennett's law office smelled exactly the same as it had 20 years earlier. Old leather, dusty paper, burnt coffee. The kind of place where lives quietly changed behind closed doors while the rest of the world kept moving outside. Rain tapped softly against the windows as I stepped inside, and every conversation in the waiting area stopped for half a second. Not because they were surprised to see me. Because they were measuring me. My black heels clicked against the hardwood floor while relatives glanced at my military jacket, my posture, the exhaustion beneath my eyes. Some offered awkward smiles. Others looked away quickly like guilt made eye contact uncomfortable. Daniel sat near the center of the room beside his wife Melissa, with one ankle resting confidently over his knee, like a king waiting for his crown. When he saw me, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. That smile. Not joyful. Victorious. "Emily," he said casually, "didn't know if you'd show." I ignored the comment and took a seat near the far end of the conference table. Harold emerged from his office moments later carrying a thick folder against his chest. He looked older than I remembered. His silver hair had thinned and grief hung heavily around his eyes. He had been my father's best friend almost as long as he'd been his attorney. "Thank you all for coming," he said quietly. Chairs shifted. Coffee cups settled. The room tightened with anticipation. Daniel leaned back comfortably. "Let's get this over with." Harold glanced at him briefly but said nothing. He opened the folder slowly. "Last will and testament of Robert and Eleanor Carter." Hearing my parents' names spoken aloud like legal property instead of human beings made my chest ache unexpectedly. For a moment I saw Mom standing at the kitchen sink humming softly, while Dad fixed the radio in the garage. Now both of them existed as paperwork. Harold adjusted his glasses. "To my son, Daniel Carter, I leave the family residence located on Carter Road, including attached structures and household property." Daniel exhaled smugly through his nose. Melissa squeezed his hand proudly. Across the room, Aunt Linda nodded like everything had unfolded exactly as expected. I kept my expression neutral. But deep inside, something still hurt. Not because I wanted the house. Because my childhood officially belonged to someone who no longer treated it like home. Harold continued. "To Daniel Carter, I also leave operational authority over Carter Feed and Supply pending final financial review." Daniel smiled wider at that. There it was. The business. The real prize. He looked toward me, finally unable to resist. "You hear that," he said softly. "Dad trusted me with the important stuff." Harold stopped reading briefly. "Daniel, please." But Daniel was enjoying himself too much now. "I mean, it makes sense." He shrugged theatrically toward the room. "One of us stayed and took responsibility." I looked at him calmly. "Today's about Mom and Dad." "No," he replied. "Today's about reality." A heavy silence settled over the room. Nobody defended me. Not one person. I noticed Melissa avoiding my eyes completely. Cowardice often looks polite from a distance. Harold resumed reading smaller asset distributions, jewelry, savings accounts, furniture, personal belongings, bits and pieces of an entire lifetime divided into legal sentences. Then finally he looked toward me, to my daughter Emily Carter. The room shifted slightly. I sat straighter unconsciously. Harold continued carefully. I leave my wife Eleanor's cedar hope chest, all military keepsakes belonging to the Carter family, and my personal letters. That was it. No house, no business, no land, just keepsakes. Around the table I saw subtle reactions immediately. Pity, awkwardness, confirmation. Daniel leaned back, slowly savoring the moment like good whiskey. Well, he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Guess all that military training should help you survive on the streets." A couple cousins laughed nervously. Someone coughed to cover discomfort. My face burned hot instantly. Not because of the insult itself, because humiliation always cuts deepest when an audience witnesses it. I stared down at my hands beneath the table. Hands scarred from deployments. Hands that carried wounded soldiers. Hands that mailed money home month after month while eating military cafeteria food overseas to save every extra dollar I could. And somehow in that room none of it mattered. Daniel smiled wider when he saw I wasn't reacting. That was always his favorite kind of victory. Quiet suffering. I stood slowly. "I think we're done here." Harold looked up immediately. "Emily, it's fine." And strangely it was, because the worst part had already happened 3 nights earlier, when my own brother locked me out of my childhood home during a thunderstorm. After surviving that embarrassment felt smaller somehow. I reached for my purse. Then Harold cleared his throat. "Actually?" He adjusted the papers carefully. "There is still one final section of the will." Daniel frowned immediately. "What final section?" Harold didn't answer him. Instead, he removed a separate sealed envelope from the folder. I noticed something strange then. His hands were trembling, to be opened only in the presence of both children. The room grew still. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. Daniel sat forward slowly now. "What is that?" Harold opened the envelope carefully and unfolded several pages. His expression changed as he read silently. Not surprise. Something closer to resignation. Finally, he looked directly at Daniel. "Your father amended portions of the estate 6 months before his death." Daniel blinked. "What?" Harold inhaled deeply. "It appears Carter Feed and Supply currently carries approximately $2.8 million in debt obligations." The room exploded into confusion immediately. Melissa turned sharply toward her husband. "What does that mean?" Daniel's face drained of color. "That's impossible." Harold continued steadily. "Several loans were secured against the business and family property over the past 4 years. I stared at my brother. He looked genuinely panicked now. "What loans?" Aunt Linda asked. Harold lowered his glasses. "According to these records, Daniel borrowed extensively against business assets." Daniel stood abruptly. "That's temporary cash flow." Using forged authorization signatures in multiple instances, Harold interrupted quietly. Dead silence. My stomach dropped. Daniel shook his head violently. "No." Harold slid documents across the table. "I'm afraid forensic accountants already confirmed the discrepancies before your father passed away." Melissa grabbed the papers with shaking hands. "Oh my God." Daniel looked around wildly now, like the room itself had betrayed him. No, Dad knew about the expansion plans." "Your father discovered the truth last winter," Harold said softly. "After the bank contacted him directly. I felt physically cold. Dad knew. All this time Dad knew?" Harold continued. "The house inheritance includes responsibility for all associated debt." Daniel stared blankly. "That means the property may be subject to seizure if obligations remain unpaid." My brother's breathing turned shallow. But Harold still wasn't finished. He looked toward me next. "To Emily Carter, Robert Carter leaves the following ownership shares in Carter Agricultural Holdings, private investment accounts established over 15 years, military survivor trust assets, and protected farmland leases held outside debt liability." Nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. Harold looked down once more before speaking the final number. "Current estimated combined value approximately $4.3 million. The room went completely silent. I genuinely thought I misheard him. Daniel whispered, "What?" Harold pulled out one final letter. "Your father also left a personal statement." His voice softened as he began reading. "To my daughter Emily. You spent your life protecting people while asking for nothing in return. You carried burdens nobody saw and sacrifices nobody fully understood. A person's character is revealed by what they do when nobody applauds them." My throat tightened instantly. Across the table, Daniel looked physically ill. Harold continued reading. "Presence alone does not equal loyalty, and distance does not erase love." Tears blurred my vision. Dad knew. He knew everything. Then suddenly a loud crash shattered the silence. Daniel collapsed sideways against the conference table before hitting the hardwood floor hard enough to rattle the chairs. Melissa screamed, and for one frozen moment, nobody moved at all. For a few seconds after Daniel hit the floor, nobody reacted. The shock was too sudden, too ugly. One moment my brother had been sitting there smirking at me like he owned the world. The next, his body lay twisted beside the conference table while Melissa screamed his name over and over. Then the room exploded into motion. Chairs scraped violently against hardwood. Aunt Linda grabbed her purse with shaking hands. One cousin started shouting for someone to call 911, while another backed against the wall staring at Daniel like he was a stranger. Training took over before emotion could. I moved first. I dropped to my knees beside him, checked his pulse, tilted his head carefully, and loosened his collar while Melissa cried hysterically beside me. "Daniel," I said firmly, "look at me." His eyes fluttered open briefly. Panic. Pure panic. Not physical pain. Fear. He grabbed my wrist hard enough to hurt. "She can't take it," he whispered hoarsely. I frowned. "Take what? The house?" Then his eyes rolled shut again. Harold was already on the phone with emergency services. I sat back slowly staring at my brother's face. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't look arrogant. He looked exhausted. Older. Broken in ways nobody in town had ever bothered noticing. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher while Melissa followed beside them, pale and trembling. One medic asked if Daniel had a history of heart problems. Harold answered quietly, "Stress." That might have been the understatement of the century. After they left, the office felt hollow. Nobody knew where to look anymore. The same relatives who had silently watched Daniel humiliate me now avoided my eyes entirely. Shame moved through the room like smoke. Aunt Linda finally cleared her throat awkwardly. "Emily, we didn't know." Number. They didn't. But part of me wanted to ask why nobody ever wondered. Why nobody questioned how a small-town feed store suddenly expanded twice in 5 years. Why nobody noticed my father growing quieter near the end of his life. Why everybody found it easier to believe the daughter in uniform abandoned her family instead of considering the son at home might not be telling the full truth. But grief had drained the fight out of me, so I simply nodded once. Harold closed the office door after the last relative left. Then he walked back toward the conference table carrying the handwritten letter from my father. "Your dad wrote more," he said softly. I sat down slowly. Outside, the rain had stopped leaving gray light pressed against the windows. Everything felt strangely still after the chaos. Harold handed me the pages carefully. "I think he wanted you to read the rest privately." The paper trembled slightly in my hands. I recognized Dad's handwriting instantly. Firm block letters, precise, controlled. Even his penmanship looked disciplined. I swallowed hard and began reading. "Emily, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and that means I failed at the one thing I hoped I'd still have time to fix. Your brother wasn't always like this." The words blurred for a second before I forced myself to continue. "When you were children, Daniel used to wait by the window every Friday for you to come home from school. He protected you from bullies. He slept outside your bedroom the night you broke your arm because he thought someone might hurt you again. Somewhere along the way, resentment replaced love. And I carry part of the blame for that." My chest tightened painfully. Dad never admitted mistakes easily, not even to himself. The letter continued. "I was proud of your service from the very first day you enlisted. But I made the mistake of admiring your strength too openly while expecting Daniel to simply understand his place. He didn't. He spent years believing he was second best in his own home." I closed my eyes briefly. God. How many years had Daniel carried that feeling around like poison? Another paragraph caught my attention immediately. "Last winter I discovered the financial documents. The forged signatures. The loans. The lies. At first, I wanted to report him to the authorities. Your mother begged me not to. She said losing one child emotionally was painful enough. She couldn't survive losing another completely." Tears slid down my face silently now. I kept reading. "So instead, I protected what little remained. Not because Daniel deserved rescuing, but because you deserved protection. You gave this family more than anyone ever acknowledged. You missed birthdays, funerals, Christmas mornings, and ordinary moments because you chose service over comfort. That kind of sacrifice rarely receives applause after people stop waving flags. But your mother and I saw it. We always saw it." A sob escaped my throat before I could stop it. For years, part of me believed my parents quietly resented my absence too. That maybe every deployment created another invisible wound between us. But Dad knew. The entire time he knew. Harold sat silently across from me while I cried. Not embarrassed tears, not dramatic ones. Just the exhausted kind grief pulls out of people when they finally stop holding themselves together. Eventually, I wiped my face carefully and continued reading. There's one more thing you deserve to know. The investment accounts began with your military paychecks. Every dollar you sent home for our medical bills we saved whenever possible after insurance covered the costs. Your mother refused to spend more than necessary because she said one day you'd need a future of your own. We added to it quietly over the years. You built most of this yourself, Emily. Not us. You? I lowered the letter slowly into my lap. The room went blurry again. All those years overseas eating cheap cafeteria meals and skipping vacations so I could send money home. Dad had protected it. For me. Harold finally spoke after a long silence. Your father came here every Thursday for nearly 6 months. I looked up. He was terrified, Harold admitted quietly. Not of dying. Of what Daniel would become after he was gone. I stared toward the rain-streaked windows. He should have told me. He didn't want you carrying more guilt. That sounded exactly like Dad. Silence settled between us again until the office door suddenly burst open hard enough to slam against the wall. Daniel. His face looked pale gray beneath the fluorescent lights. Melissa stood behind him, trying unsuccessfully to stop him from entering. You, he snapped the second he saw me. Harold stood immediately. Daniel, this isn't the time. She manipulated him, Daniel shouted. I stared at my brother in disbelief. His hospital bracelet still hung from his wrist. You think I manipulated Dad from Afghanistan? I asked quietly. You always knew how to make him love you more. The words echoed painfully through the office. Not because they were true, because deep down Daniel truly believed them. I rose slowly from my chair. For 16 years, I said carefully, I kept hoping one day you'd stop seeing me as competition. Daniel laughed bitterly. Easy for you to say. You were always the hero. No. My voice finally hardened. I was just the daughter who left. He froze slightly at that. The truth hit harder because it came without anger. I stepped closer. You think this inheritance is revenge? I asked. It isn't. It's what Dad did after realizing you were destroying yourself. Daniel's eyes filled suddenly with something fragile beneath the rage. Fear. Regret. Maybe even shame. I stayed, he whispered weakly. I was there. I know. You left us. The accusation landed softer this time. Less hatred, more hurt. And suddenly I understood something terrible. Daniel hadn't spent years trying to beat me. He spent years trying not to feel abandoned. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I never wanted to leave you behind, I said quietly. I just wanted a life bigger than this town. His face crumpled slightly. Not dramatic. Just enough for me to glimpse the little boy Dad described in the letter. The one who once slept outside my bedroom to protect me. Then the moment vanished. Daniel looked away first. And for the first time in our lives, winning no longer felt like victory. 3 weeks after the will reading, the Carter house stood almost empty. The construction trucks were gone. The for sale sign Daniel had ordered never made it into the yard, and the bank had already started legal proceedings against the property. Small towns have a way of digesting scandal quickly. By then, everybody knew the story. The son who inherited debt, the army daughter who inherited millions, the forged loans, the hidden accounts. People suddenly smiled at me differently in grocery stores. That bothered me more than the earlier pity ever had. Respect that arrives after money isn't really respect at all. I parked beside the white fence one last time just after sunrise. Morning fog drifted low across the fields, while the old maple tree beside the porch swayed gently in the wind. For a moment the house almost looked alive again. I sat in the truck longer than necessary, because walking inside meant accepting this would truly be the last time. The front door creaked softly when I opened it. Silence greeted me immediately. Not peaceful silence, the hollow kind. The kind abandoned places carry after laughter disappears. Most of the furniture was already gone. Dust outlines remained where tables and cabinets used to sit. The living room echoed faintly beneath my footsteps. But memories still lived everywhere. Right there near the staircase, Mom once measured our height with pencil marks every birthday. Near the fireplace, Dad taught me how to shine boots before basic training. In the kitchen doorway, Daniel punched a boy in high school for making me cry after prom. That memory stopped me cold. For years, resentment had rewritten my brother into someone cruel in my mind. But people are rarely only one thing. Daniel loved me once. Maybe he still did underneath all the damage. I walked slowly toward Dad's workshop in the garage. The smell hit first. Machine oil, sawdust, metal, home. Dad's old radio still sat on the shelf beside scattered screws and unfinished projects. Reading glasses rested near a coffee mug stained dark from years of use. I picked up one of his flannel jackets hanging beside the door and held it against my chest. It still smelled faintly like him. That almost destroyed me. Not the inheritance, not the betrayal, that smell. Because grief lives inside tiny ordinary things nobody prepares you for. I sat on the old workshop stool and finally allowed myself to cry properly for the first time since coming home. Not quiet tears, real ones, the kind that leave your chest aching afterward. I cried for my mother, for my father, for the years I missed, for Daniel, for the family we almost were, and for the terrible truth that love sometimes survives even when relationships don't. After a while, I wiped my face and opened the bottom cabinet beneath Dad's workbench. Inside sat a neatly folded American flag protected inside a clear display case. Mine. The one presented to my parents during my deployment ceremony overseas. I stared at it silently. Dad had kept it hidden safely all these years. Beneath the case rested a small handwritten note. For wherever life finally takes you. That was all it said. Simple. Exactly like him. I smiled through fresh tears. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel. I turned slowly. He looked thinner than he had weeks earlier. The confidence was gone now. So was the arrogance. He stood awkwardly near the garage entrance with both hands shoved into his jacket pockets. I figured you'd come here, he said quietly. Neither of us moved. Morning light spilled through the garage windows between us. Finally, he nodded toward the flag in my hands. Dad kept that out here almost every day. I looked down at it carefully. I didn't know. He talked about you constantly when you were deployed. That hurt in a different way. Daniel leaned against the doorway, eyes fixed on the floor. The bank's taking the house next month. I already knew that. Harold had explained everything days earlier. The debt was too large. Selling the property wouldn't cover half of it. Daniel swallowed hard. Melissa left. I stayed silent. She took the kids to her sister's place. There it was. The real collapse. Not in Harold's office. Here. A man standing inside the ruins of his own choices, realizing too late what they cost him. I studied my brother carefully. He looked tired. Not physically. Spiritually. Like life had finally forced him to stop lying to himself. You know what the worst part is? He asked suddenly. I didn't answer. He gave a hollow laugh. Dad still protected me in the end. I frowned slightly. Daniel rubbed his eyes. He could have sent me to prison. Yes, he could have. But he didn't, Daniel whispered. Because despite everything, our father still loved him. That realization finally seemed to break whatever pride Daniel had left. He looked around the garage slowly. I kept thinking if I made enough money, if I made the business bigger. His voice cracked. Maybe for once he'd look at me the way he looked at you. Pain moved through me sharply then. Not satisfaction. Pain. Because all these years we had been grieving different versions of the same wound. I stepped closer slowly. Dad was proud of you too. Daniel shook his head immediately. Not like you. You stayed when things got hard. Yeah, he muttered bitterly. And look what I did with it. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Outside, birds chirped softly across the fields. Finally, Daniel looked at me directly. Why did you help me that day in the office? What do you mean? You could have let me choke on my own panic attack. I almost laughed at how absurd that sounded. You're still my brother. Daniel stared at me like he didn't understand the sentence. Maybe he didn't. Then quietly, almost ashamed, he asked, After everything, why are you still helping with the debts? Because Harold didn't know yet, but I'd already decided to use part of the inheritance to settle the remaining medical bills, protect the family cemetery plot, and make sure Daniel's children didn't lose absolutely everything. Not because he earned it. Because bitterness spreads unless somebody chooses to stop carrying it forward. I looked around Dad's workshop one final time before answering. Because one of us had to remember what family was supposed to mean. Daniel's face crumpled. Not dramatically. Just enough. A man trying not to cry at 46 years old inside his dead father's garage. I walked past him carrying the folded flag carefully against my chest. At the front door I paused one last time. Morning sunlight poured through the windows, now warming the empty hallway where childhood photographs once hung. Dust floated quietly through the golden light. For the first time since returning home, the house no longer felt haunted. It felt finished. I stepped onto the porch and breathed in the cool country air. Behind me, Daniel remained standing silently in the doorway. Neither of us said goodbye. Some relationships don't heal in a single conversation, but sometimes survival itself is enough of a beginning. I placed the flag carefully in the passenger seat of my truck before climbing behind the wheel. As I drove down Carter Road for the last time, the rising sun spilled across the fields my father loved so much. And somewhere deep inside me, the anger finally loosened its grip. Not because justice erased the pain, but because love had outlived it. If this story touched you in any way, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced betrayal inside your own family? Or discovered love where you least expected it? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that dignity, sacrifice, and kindness still matter in this world. And if you enjoy emotional stories about family resilience and justice, subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. There are so many more stories waiting to be shared with you. The ballroom went silent so fast I could hear the ice crack inside someone's whiskey glass. My sister stood frozen beside her wedding cake, her bouquet trembling in her hands, while her future father-in-law stared at me with the smug confidence of a man who had spent his entire life humiliating people in public and never once been challenged for it. "You can put medals on a woman," he said loudly, lifting his champagne glass toward the crowd, "but that doesn't make her respectable." A few nervous laughs scattered across the room. Then he looked directly at me. At some point, he continued, "A woman has to admit she failed at building a real family." My sister's face drained of color. My father lowered his eyes, and I slowly stood up in my army dress uniform after 23 years of military service, and asked the one question that made the old man nearly collapse in front of 400 guests. "Mr. Whitmore," I said calmly, "do you have any idea what you did in Fallujah?" The smile disappeared from his face instantly. His fingers loosened around the champagne glass. "What?" he whispered. For the first time all evening, the room belonged to me, and 10 minutes later people would understand why. But to explain that night, I have to take you back to the day my mother died. I was 19 years old when my father walked out on us. Not disappeared. Not vanished. He walked out carefully, deliberately, like a man leaving a restaurant after paying the check. He packed his leather suitcase on a Thursday afternoon, while my mother stood in the kitchen gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. My little sister Emma was only 9 then. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor coloring a horse in a dollar store coloring book, while our father calmly told my mother he deserved happiness. I still remember the smell of burnt coffee in the kitchen. I remember the sound of ice dropping into his glass while my mother cried quietly. And I remember the exact moment I stopped being a daughter. Because someone had to become the adult in that house. The woman my father left us for was 28 years old. Blonde, perfect teeth, worked in real estate. He met her at a charity golf event and apparently decided 2 daughters and a sick wife no longer fit the image he wanted for the second half of his life. 3 weeks later, he moved into a lakefront house with her outside Charlotte. 3 months later, he stopped answering Emma's calls. My mother never recovered from it emotionally. She tried to pretend she did. She still made Emma pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse on Saturdays, still folded laundry while humming old Fleetwood Mac songs under her breath, still smiled when neighbors asked how she was doing. But grief has weight, and eventually it crushes people slowly enough that nobody notices until they can barely stand anymore. 2 years later, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Stage 4. I was 21 when the doctor explained treatment options using words that sounded strangely clinical compared to the horror sitting in that room. Aggressive progression, limited response rates, palliative care. Emma cried immediately. My mother apologized. That was the kind of woman she was, dying in front of her children and somehow still worried about inconveniencing us. My father came to the hospital exactly once. He wore an expensive gray coat and checked his phone 3 times while the oncologist spoke. When he left, he kissed my mother on the forehead like a businessman leaving a networking event. Emma waited 2 weeks for him to come back. He never did. The night my mother died, rain hit the hospital windows so hard it sounded like gravel. Emma fell asleep with her head in my lap while machines beeped softly around us. I remember brushing her hair away from her face and realizing how small she still looked. How young. Too young to lose everyone. My mother looked at me during her final hour with eyes already fading around the edges. "Promise me," she whispered. I knew what she meant before she said it. "Don't let her feel abandoned." I nodded because I couldn't speak. And after she was gone, after the nurses shut off the machines and Emma screamed into my shoulder so hard her body shook, I stood in that hospital hallway and made a decision that changed the entire course of my life. I joined the Army 3 months later. Not because I dreamed about medals or patriotism or adventure. I joined because military housing came with stability. Because healthcare mattered. Because Emma needed school supplies and winter boots and someone who wouldn't disappear when things got hard. I became a logistics officer first, then intelligence support, then overseas coordination. My 20s disappeared inside military bases, deployment schedules, early morning briefings, and long nights staring at government laptops under fluorescent lights. But every month money went into Emma's account. Every birthday gifts arrived. Every school play, every dance recital, every heartbreak after some idiot teenage boy made her cry. I was there somehow, even if it was through a shaky video call from another continent. When Emma got pneumonia at 13, I spent 11 hours arguing with a commanding officer until I secured emergency leave. When she had nightmares after Mom died, I stayed awake talking to her until sunrise despite having field training at dawn. And when she graduated high school, she searched the crowd for me before she searched for anyone else. That nearly broke me, because by then she didn't look at me like a sister anymore. She looked at me like home. People love talking about sacrifice like it's noble and cinematic. They picture dramatic music and waving flags. Real sacrifice is quieter than that. It's eating cold takeout alone in military housing, because your little sister needed braces more than you needed furniture. It's pretending holidays don't hurt. It's sitting in your car outside elementary schools after parent-teacher meetings because you're 26 years old and suddenly responsible for raising a child who isn't yours. There were nights I cried from exhaustion after Emma fell asleep during our calls. Nights I wondered what my life might have looked like if I'd chosen myself instead. Marriage. Children. A house somewhere peaceful. But every time those thoughts surfaced, guilt crushed them immediately. Because Emma never asked for any of this. None of it was her fault. By the time I turned 42, I had reached the rank of lieutenant colonel. Emma had become a second-grade teacher in Savannah, Georgia. She rented a little white cottage with blue shutters and grew herbs on the porch because our mother used to love gardening. She still called me every Sunday evening, still asked if I was eating enough, still said goodnight the exact same way she had when she was 9 years old. Love you bigger than the sky. And every single time I answered the same way. Always bigger. I truly believed the hardest part of our lives was behind us. I had no idea that the man who would eventually try humiliating me at my sister's wedding had already entered our lives. And when he did, everything began to change. Emma met Daniel Whitmore on a rainy Thursday afternoon because a little boy in her class swallowed a quarter. That was the story she told me later while laughing into the phone like a teenager trying not to sound too excited. The child's mother panicked, the school nurse overreacted, and Daniel, who happened to volunteer one afternoon a month at the pediatric clinic nearby, came over to help calm everyone down. He was kind, Emma told me softly. Not fake kind, real kind. I was sitting alone in temporary housing outside Fort Bragg at the time, eating microwaved soup from a paper bowl while rain tapped against the windows. I could hear something in her voice I hadn't heard in years. Hope. Not the desperate kind people force onto themselves after heartbreak. Something quieter, safer. What's he do, I asked. He's a cardiologist. I said, so he's rich. Emma laughed. That's your first question. No, I replied. My first question is whether he treats you well. The second question is whether he's rich enough to afford therapy after meeting our family. She laughed so hard she snorted. That was Emma. Even at 32, she still snorted when she laughed too hard. Over the next few months, Daniel slowly became part of our lives through stories first. Tiny details. The way he always carried extra granola bars in his car because he worried Emma forgot to eat lunch during school days. The way he fixed her leaking kitchen faucet without making a big show of it. The way he sat with her elderly neighbor for 2 hours after the woman's husband died. He sounded steady, grounded. And after everything Emma had lived through, steady mattered more to me than charming ever could. The first time I met him in person was during Thanksgiving at Emma's cottage. I arrived late because my flight had been delayed in Atlanta. By the time I pulled into the driveway, warm, yellow light glowed through the windows, while jazz music drifted faintly from inside the house. When Daniel opened the front door, he looked exactly like the kind of man older women in grocery stores trust immediately. Tall, dark hair touched with early gray at the temples, Calm eyes, clean sweater, no arrogance in his posture. But what mattered most was the way he looked at Emma, like she was something fragile he intended to protect carefully. Not own, protect. That distinction matters more than most people realize. "You must be Claire," he said warmly, offering his hand. "I've heard terrifying things about you." "I hope so," I answered. Emma appeared behind him wearing one of Mom's old aprons, flour dusted across her cheek, and for a moment something inside my chest loosened. Because she looked happy. Truly happy. Dinner that night felt almost normal, the kind of normal people take for granted until life teaches them how rare it actually is. Emma kept refilling everyone's wine glasses. Daniel helped carry dishes without being asked. We told embarrassing childhood stories while rain hammered softly outside. Then Daniel mentioned his father, and the entire mood shifted in ways subtle enough that Emma probably didn't notice. "My parents are hosting Christmas this year," he said carefully. "You should come." Emma smiled nervously. "Your father still thinks I'm too liberal." Daniel gave an exhausted little laugh. "My father thinks everyone is too liberal." "Politics, I asked." Controlled, Daniel replied quietly. That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. A few weeks later, I met Richard Whitmore for the first time. The man owned 3 private equity firms, sat on multiple charity boards, and carried himself with the polished confidence of someone who had spent decades believing money made him wiser than other people. His house outside Charleston looked less like a home and more like a resort designed by someone desperate to impress strangers. Marble floors, massive chandeliers, paintings nobody actually enjoyed but everyone pretended to admire. Emma squeezed my arm before we entered. "Please," she whispered, "just survive dinner." "I survived Kandahar," I muttered. "How bad can rich people be?" I learned the answer 20 minutes later. Richard Whitmore shook my hand without warmth and immediately noticed my posture. "You're military," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir." His eyes moved over me, slowly assessing, judging. "You still active duty at your age?" "At my age," I repeated. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I suppose some people have trouble adjusting to civilian life." Emma shifted uncomfortably beside me. Daniel immediately stepped in. "Claire's a lieutenant colonel." "Impressive," Richard said flatly, though his tone suggested the opposite. "Though I always find it unfortunate when women sacrifice personal lives for careers." I stared at him calmly. "And I find it unfortunate when men confuse money with wisdom," I answered. A dangerous flicker crossed his face. Daniel nearly choked on his drink. Emma kicked me lightly under the table. The conversation moved on after that, but the temperature in the room never recovered. Over the following months, Richard's disdain became impossible to ignore. He disguised insults as observations. "You never married. Must be difficult spending holidays alone." I imagine military culture hardens women emotionally. Sometimes he said these things privately, sometimes in front of others. The strange part wasn't his cruelty. It was the way he watched me afterward, like he was studying whether I recognized him. At first I thought I imagined it. But then came the rehearsal dinner. Emma had chosen a small waterfront restaurant overlooking Charleston Harbor. Candlelight reflected across the water, while soft piano music drifted through the room. Everyone seemed relaxed for once, until a waiter accidentally bumped my shoulder and knocked open the edge of my dress uniform jacket. Richard saw the insignia stitched beneath it. Specifically the old unit patch I rarely wore anymore. His face changed instantly. Not anger, fear. Tiny, fleeting, but unmistakable. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly I noticed even from across the table. "You all right, Dad?" Daniel asked. Richard grabbed his wine glass too quickly. "Fine." But he wasn't fine. For the next hour he barely spoke. Twice I caught him staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. And just once I saw something I never expected from a man like Richard Whitmore. Panic. Late that night, after Emma fell asleep in the hotel suite beside me, I sat alone on the balcony overlooking the harbor while humid wind rolled off the water. I kept replaying his expression in my head. Where had he seen that patch before? Why did it affect him so deeply? I almost convinced myself I was overthinking it. Until the next morning. I was walking through the hotel lobby when I heard Richard Whitmore arguing quietly with someone on the phone near the elevators. "I told you that file was buried," he hissed. A pause. "No, listen to me carefully. If anyone reopens Fallujah, we all have a problem." Every instinct military service had sharpened inside me came alive instantly. He turned suddenly and froze when he saw me standing there. For 3 full seconds neither of us spoke. Then he forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked casually. I smiled back. "Not when something feels wrong." And for the first time since meeting him, Richard Whitmore looked genuinely afraid of me. By the morning of the wedding, Charleston smelled like saltwater magnolia blossoms and money. The ceremony was being held at an old estate overlooking the harbor, one of those sprawling southern properties with white columns, manicured gardens, and enough imported flowers to feed a small country. Staff members moved around silently in black uniforms, while violin music floated through the open courtyard. Everything looked perfect. That's the dangerous thing about wealthy families. They know how to decorate pain beautifully. I stood alone in the bridal suite, adjusting the cuffs of my dress uniform, while Emma sat in front of a mirror surrounded by makeup brushes and champagne glasses. She looked breathtaking. Not because of the dress, though it was elegant enough to belong in a magazine. Not because of the professionally curled hair or the diamond earrings Daniel gave her the night before. She looked breathtaking because she was happy. Nervous, yes, emotional, but happy in the purest way. For a few minutes I simply watched her silently. The little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms was getting married. "You're staring," she said softly through the mirror. "I'm trying to figure out when you stopped being 9. Emma smiled sadly. "Probably around the same time you stopped being 19. That hit harder than she intended. She turned in the chair and reached for my hand. "You know, you didn't have to give me your whole life, right?" I looked away immediately. Because if I met her eyes too long, I might cry. And I had spent too many years teaching myself not to. "You were never a burden," I said quietly. "I know, that's what makes it worse." Before I could answer, the suite door opened. My father walked in. For a second, nobody moved. It had been almost 6 years since I'd seen him in person. Age had softened him physically, but not spiritually. His hair had gone silver around the sides, and his expensive tan looked slightly artificial beneath the indoor lighting. Behind him stood his new wife, Melissa, the same woman he abandoned our mother for decades earlier. She wore pearls. My mother died wearing a hospital bracelet. Funny how the mind remembers details like that. "Emma," my father said warmly, arms opening as if he belonged there. "Look at you." Emma stood slowly, uncertain. Part of her still wanted a father, even after everything. That's the tragedy of abandonment. Children continue loving people who do not deserve it. He hugged her carefully while Melissa dabbed fake tears from the corners of her eyes. Then he looked at me. "Claire." "That's still my name," I replied. An uncomfortable silence followed. Melissa immediately stepped in with forced brightness. "This is such a beautiful day. We should focus on healing." Healing. I almost laughed. People who destroy families always become obsessed with healing once consequences embarrass them publicly. But Emma looked overwhelmed already, so I swallowed every bitter thing rising in my throat. For her. Always for her. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Daniel cried the moment Emma walked down the aisle. Actual tears. No embarrassment about it either. That mattered to me more than he probably realized. And when he looked at her during the vows, I believed he loved her honestly, which made what happened later even more painful. The reception began just after sunset. Crystal chandeliers glowed above the ballroom while servers carried trays of champagne through clusters of laughing guests. A jazz band played softly near the dance floor. Politicians, surgeons, investors, and socialites filled the room wearing expressions polished carefully over decades of expensive living. I stayed mostly near the edges of the room. Military service teaches you how to observe quietly. And from the edges, you notice everything. The way Richard Whitmore drank faster every time our eyes met. The way he kept whispering to 2 men I didn't recognize. The way my father avoided standing near me entirely. At one point, Emma found me beside the terrace doors. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded. "You sure?" "No," I admitted. That made her smile a little. "Thank you for being here anyway." I touched her cheek gently. There's nowhere else I'd be. Then Richard Whitmore tapped his champagne glass with a spoon. The room slowly quieted. Here it comes, I thought. Rich men love microphones almost as much as they love themselves. Richard stood near the center of the ballroom in an expensive tuxedo, smiling with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling every room he entered. To family, he began smoothly. Guests lifted glasses. To legacy, to tradition, to building lives worth admiring. Polite applause followed. Then his eyes landed on me, and something cold entered his expression. Of course, he continued, not everyone understands what family truly means. Emma stiffened beside Daniel instantly. Richard kept smiling. Some people mistake sacrifice for virtue when really... He shrugged lightly. They simply failed at building lives of their own. A few uncomfortable chuckles scattered through the crowd. Daniel frowned. Dad. But Richard ignored him. I mean, let's be honest. Hiding behind medals and uniforms may impress strangers, but eventually a woman has to ask herself why she ended up alone. The room went completely still. Emma whispered, "Oh my God." Richard raised his glass slightly toward me. A real legacy, he said, is marriage, children, stability, not becoming a middle-aged soldier nobody comes home to. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward me. And then came the worst part. My father said nothing. Not one word. He stood there holding a whiskey glass while another man humiliated the daughter who spent half her life raising his child. That silence hurt more than the insult itself. Emma's eyes filled with tears immediately. "Stop," she whispered to Richard. But he was enjoying himself now. Men like him always do. "You know," he added casually, "I almost feel sorry for women who convince themselves independence is strength. Usually it's just loneliness wearing expensive camouflage." I slowly set my champagne glass down. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Then I stood. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Calm. That's what unsettled people most. 23 years in the Army teaches you how to control your emotions long after everyone else loses theirs. Richard watched me approach with smug satisfaction, certain he had already won. I stopped directly in front of him, close enough to see sweat gathering near his collar despite the air conditioning, close enough to notice his hand trembling slightly around the stem of his glass. Then I asked quietly, "Mr. Whitmore, do you have any idea what you did in Fallujah?" His entire body froze. The color vanished from his face instantly. "What?" he whispered. The ballroom fell silent. And for the first time all night, Richard Whitmore looked terrified. For a moment, nobody in the ballroom moved. The jazz band had stopped playing sometime during Richard's speech, though I don't think anyone remembered exactly when. Glasses remained frozen halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-breath. Even the waitstaff stood motionless near the walls, sensing instinctively that something dangerous had entered the room. Richard Whitmore stared at me like a man who had just seen a ghost wearing his own face. I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the words came out too quickly, too rehearsed. I had spent most of my adult life around people trained to lie under pressure. Politicians, contractors, intelligence officers, men dragged into interrogation rooms trying desperately to keep secrets buried beneath confidence. Fear always sounds the same eventually, and Richard Whitmore was terrified. I tilted my head slightly. "Really?" Daniel stepped forward, immediately confused and alarmed. "Claire, what's going on?" I looked at him carefully before answering. "Your father and I have crossed paths before. He just doesn't know it." "That's absurd," Richard snapped, suddenly recovering enough arrogance to raise his voice again. "I've never met you before in my life." "Not personally," I replied calmly, "but I've spent 7 years reading reports connected to your name." Now people were whispering openly. I saw Melissa gripping my father's arm. I saw Emma shaking beside Daniel, trying desperately to understand how her wedding had become a battlefield. Part of me hated myself for this moment, but another part remembered body bags, smoke, blood, and a 19-year-old soldier crying for his father after shrapnel tore through his lungs. Some truths arrive late because they need witnesses. Richard forced out a brittle laugh. "This is unbelievable. You're ruining your sister's wedding because you can't tolerate criticism." "No," I said softly. "I'm ruining your evening because you mistook my silence for weakness." That shut him up. I reached into the inside pocket of my dress uniform slowly. The movement alone made him pale further. Then I removed a folded document. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just paper. Funny how paper frightens powerful men more than weapons sometimes. 20 years ago, I said clearly during the Second Battle of Fallujah, a private military supplier delivered defective armored transport components to Marine support units operating west of the city. A few older veterans in the crowd straightened immediately. They recognized the name. Fallujah. Richard swallowed hard. I continued. 3 convoys experienced catastrophic equipment failures over a period of 8 days. 1 vehicle lost side panel reinforcement after an IED blast that should not have penetrated the armor. Daniel looked between us, completely lost now. "What does this have to do with my father?" I met his eyes. "Everything." The room had become so quiet I could hear silverware clinking faintly in the distant kitchen. 7 soldiers died, I said. 11 more suffered permanent injuries. Internal investigations blamed battlefield conditions initially. I paused. But battlefield conditions weren't the real problem. Richard suddenly stepped forward. "This conversation is over." No, I replied. It's finally beginning. His breathing had changed now, shorter, uneven. That's when I knew for certain. Guilty men remember details innocent men forget. I unfolded the document carefully. Whitmore Strategic Logistics held subcontract authority over reinforcement materials used in those vehicles. Daniel frowned immediately. Dad. Richard looked furious now, but beneath the anger lived panic. Government contracts involve hundreds of people, he barked. You can't throw around accusations because of some ancient military report. Ancient, I asked quietly. Interesting word choice. Emma moved toward me slowly. Claire, what is this? I looked at my little sister. And suddenly I saw her at 9 years old again, standing in a hospital hallway after Mom died, clutching my hand because she was afraid everyone she loved would eventually leave her too. I hated that she had to hear any of this tonight. But lies had already poisoned too many lives. 3 years ago, I said softly to Emma, a federal review reopened procurement records connected to Fallujah after new whistleblower testimony surfaced. Richard whispered something under his breath. A prayer, maybe? Or a curse? The review uncovered falsified durability certifications. I looked directly at him. Documents signed under companies linked to your father-in-law. Daniel's face lost all color. No, he said immediately. No, my dad would never. Daniel, Richard interrupted sharply. Too sharply. That was the mistake. Because everyone heard it. Everyone heard the fear. I stepped closer to Richard until only a few feet separated us. Do you remember Staff Sergeant Michael Torres? I asked quietly. His eyes widened. There it is, I thought. Recognition. His convoy was hit November 17th, I continued. He survived the explosion initially. Then the side reinforcement failed during extraction. Richard looked physically ill now. He burned alive inside the vehicle while 2 Marines tried to pull him out. Emma covered her mouth. Several guests looked horrified. And suddenly the ballroom no longer resembled a wedding reception. It resembled judgment. I didn't know, Richard whispered weakly. That almost made me angry enough to lose control. Almost. You knew enough to bury reports, I said coldly. You knew enough to pressure inspectors. You knew enough to move money through shell suppliers after the investigation began. That's not true. Then why did federal prosecutors reopen the case? Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. I slowly handed him the folded document. His hand shook visibly as he took it. Daniel stared at the page over his shoulder. Then I watched the exact moment his son stopped seeing Richard Whitmore as untouchable. What is this? Daniel whispered. Richard didn't answer. So I did. A federal summons. The room erupted into whispers instantly. Richard's face collapsed inward somehow. 20 years of polished confidence cracked all at once, revealing something weak and desperate underneath. You investigated me? He asked hoarsely. No, I replied. I investigated why American soldiers died inside vehicles that were supposed to protect them. I leaned closer. And eventually your name kept appearing. Melissa began crying quietly near the back of the room. My father still said nothing. Cowardice ages badly. You can always recognize it in old men. Richard looked at me with naked hatred now. You waited until my son's wedding. I stared at him for several long seconds before answering. No, I said softly. You humiliated yourself at your son's wedding. I simply stopped protecting you. That landed harder than anything else. Because it was true. If he had left me alone tonight, I would have stayed silent for Emma's sake. But men like Richard mistake restraint for surrender. And eventually they push the wrong person too far. Daniel stepped backward slowly away from his father. Tell me she's lying. Richard opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No words came out. And in that moment his son got his answer. I looked down at the summons still trembling in Richard's hand. They'll be expecting you Monday morning, I said quietly. Then I stepped back. And Richard Whitmore, millionaire socialite patriarch, looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, while finally realizing there was never any ground beneath him at all. The wedding did not end with music. It ended with the sound of chairs scraping backward, guests whispering into phones, and Richard Whitmore standing under a crystal chandelier with a federal summons trembling in his hand. For a few minutes nobody seemed to know what to do with themselves. Wealthy people are usually excellent at pretending nothing is wrong, but some truths are too large to hide beneath polite smiles and imported champagne. Daniel was the first to move. He turned away from his father and walked straight to Emma. She stood near the wedding cake, pale and shaking one hand pressed against her stomach as if she might be sick. Her veil had slipped slightly from her hair. Mascara darkened the corners of her eyes. She looked less like a bride then, and more like the little girl I used to find curled on the hallway floor after nightmares. Daniel reached for her but stopped inches away. He did not assume he had the right to touch her. That mattered. "Emma," he said, his voice broken, "I didn't know." She stared at him for a long second. "Did you suspect anything?" "Number. Did you know he hated Claire?" Daniel closed his eyes. "I knew he was cruel," he whispered. "I kept telling myself he was just old-fashioned, difficult, proud." His voice cracked. "I should have protected you from him before tonight." Emma looked at me. There was no anger in her eyes, only pain, confusion, exhaustion, and something else. Recognition. As if for the first time she understood that I had spent years standing between her and storms she never even saw. Richard tried to regain control then because men like him do not know how to exist without control. "This is family business," he barked. "Everyone leave." But nobody moved quickly. Not anymore. His voice had lost its power. Daniel turned toward him slowly. "No, Dad. This stopped being family business when soldiers died." Richard's mouth tightened. "You don't understand what government contracts are like. Mistakes happen. War is messy." I watched Daniel flinch at that. War is messy. The phrase sounded almost obscene beneath the wedding lights. I thought of Sergeant Torres, of the folded flag mailed to his widow, of young men writing letters home from desert bases believing the people supplying their equipment valued their lives more than profit margins. Daniel removed his wedding boutonniere with shaking fingers and dropped it onto a nearby table. "I'm done defending you," he said. Richard stared at his son like he had been slapped. Emma quietly took Daniel's hand. "Not forgiveness? Not yet. But a choice. And sometimes that is where healing begins." My father appeared beside me a few minutes later, holding his whiskey glass like a shield. "Claire," he said quietly, "I think we should talk." I looked at him. Really looked. At the man whose absence shaped my entire adult life. The man who left my mother to die without dignity, who let me become a parent before I was old enough to fully become myself, who stood silent while another man called me a failure. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked. He swallowed. "I know I wasn't perfect." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was so small, so cowardly. Not perfect. As if abandonment was a flaw like being late to dinner. "You weren't imperfect," I said. "You were gone." His face twitched. Melissa stood several feet behind him, suddenly very interested in the carpet. "I was young," he said. "You were 43. I was unhappy." "So was Mom," I replied. "She stayed." That landed. For once he had no easy answer. He looked toward Emma, then back at me. "I want to make things right." "You had chances." "Claire." "No." My voice stayed calm, but something old and tired rose beneath it. "When Mom got sick, you had a chance. When Emma cried herself to sleep, you had a chance. When I mailed you graduation photos, school bills, medical forms, every document you should have helped sign, you had chances." His eyes reddened, but I did not soften. Some tears come too late to be useful. "And tonight," I added, "when that man humiliated me in front of everyone, you had one final chance." He looked down. "You said nothing." The words sat between us like a closed door. Then I walked away. Not angry, not victorious, free. Outside, the night air was cooler than I expected. The harbor lights shimmered in the distance, scattered across the black water like broken glass. I stood on the terrace alone, breathing slowly, letting the noise behind me fade. A few minutes later, Emma joined me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder just like she used to when she was little. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For needing so much from you." I turned toward her immediately. "Emma, no." I didn't know she said, crying now. "I knew you gave up things, but I didn't know how much of yourself you buried just so I could feel safe." The wind moved softly through her veil. I touched the side of her face. "I made Mom a promise." "I know, and I'd make it again." She broke then, folding into me with the same small sound she made the night our mother died. I held her tightly, one arm around her shoulders, my chin resting against her hair. "You were never the shame of this family," she whispered. I closed my eyes. "You were the only reason I still believed I had one." That nearly undid me. Later, Emma and Daniel decided not to continue the reception. There would be no more speeches, no first dance beneath chandeliers, no staged photographs with people who cared more about image than love. A week later, they married quietly in Emma's backyard. 20 people came. Her students made paper flowers. Her elderly neighbor baked lemon bars. Daniel wore a simple navy suit. Emma wore the same dress but no veil this time. and I walked her down the aisle. Not our father. Me. At the end, she squeezed my arm and whispered, "Love you bigger than the sky." For the first time in years, my voice shook when I answered, "Always bigger." Before leaving that evening, I stood beside a small framed photograph of our mother on the porch table. Her smile was soft, tired, beautiful. I touched 2 fingers to the frame. "I kept my promise," I whispered. And maybe that was the real revenge. Not destroying Richard Whitmore. Not exposing my father's cowardice. But standing there after all those years watching the girl I raised build a life no one could take from her. Because some people share your blood and still never become family. And some people spend their whole lives holding the roof up, never asking anyone to notice. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you believe family is made by blood loyalty or sacrifice. We have many more stories like this to share every day, so subscribe and stay with us for the next one. Thank you for listening.